Hey, welcome back, my friend. If you're here right now, tucked in lights low, maybe a little fan humming in the background, then I think you and I are going to get along just fine. Tonight we're not talking about kings or battles or great empires rising and falling. Tonight we're going smaller, more intimate. We're going inside the home. Because here's something that stopped me cold when I first learned it. For nearly all of human history across every civilization on Earth, the concept of a room of your own simply did not exist. Not for the poor, not for the middle class, and in many cases not even for the powerful. A bedroom was not a private place. A kitchen was not a separate room. A family did not have a house. A family was the house packed in together with children, grandparents, servants, apprentices, chickens, pigs, and the occasional cow. And nobody thought that was strange. So when did privacy become something we expect? When did we decide that having your own space was not a luxury but a right? And what did we actually lose when walls went up and doors were closed? These are the questions we're going to sit with tonight. And I promise you the answers are stranger, warmer, and more surprising than you might think. But before we start, if this kind of storytelling feels like your thing, if this is the kind of late-night company you've been looking for, I would genuinely love it if you hit that subscribe button and gave this video a like. Not because some algorithm is demanding it, but because it really does help more people find these stories. And honestly, knowing you're out there listening makes me want to keep going. Drop a comment too if you feel like it. Tell me where you are right now. Tell me what time it is. Are you in bed? On the couch? Somewhere in between? I love knowing that someone across the world is drifting off to a story I spent weeks putting together for them. Now dim the lights a little more if you can. Let the fan run. Take a slow breath. And let's step back in time together. Let's start about 2,000 years ago. Ancient Rome. When most of us picture Rome, we picture marble columns, toga-clad senators, grand fountains and sunlit plazas, and yes, all of that existed. But that was the Rome of maybe 1% of the population. For everyone else, for the craftsmen, the merchants, the labourers, the freed slaves, the bakers and the sandal makers and the fishmongers, Rome was something entirely different. It was a city of towers, not gleaming ones. Rickety, overcrowded, dangerous towers made of wood and brick and wishful thinking crammed so tightly together that the streets below barely saw sunlight. These buildings were called insulae. The word literally means islands in Latin because each tower stood alone, surrounded by narrow lanes on all four sides, like an island in a sea of stone. And according to ancient records, by the 4th century of the Common Era, Rome had roughly 46,000 of these buildings. 46,000 compared to fewer than 1,800 private homes for the elite. So if you lived in Rome and you were not extraordinarily wealthy, you lived in one of these towers. And life inside was an experience. Imagine a building 5, 6, sometimes 7 floors tall. No elevator, obviously. No running water above the ground floor. No proper kitchen on the upper levels. The apartments got smaller and cheaper and more dangerous the higher you climbed. Ground floor a little safer, a little bigger, a little more expensive. Top floor, you paid next to nothing. And in exchange you got a room barely large enough to lie down in wooden floors with gaps that let in the winter cold. Walls so thin you could hear your neighbour snoring, and a ceiling that might on a bad day choose to become your floor. Ancient writers were not quiet about this. The satirist Juvenal, who lived and wrote in Rome around the late 1st and early 2nd century of the Common Era, complained that walking through the city meant living in constant fear of something falling on your head. He was talking about the buildings themselves. Entire insulae sometimes collapsed without warning, not small sections, the whole thing. Emperor Augustus had to pass a law capping building height at 70 Roman feet, specifically because landlords kept building taller and taller in pursuit of rent, until the structures gave up and came down. And fire, oh the fire! Because residents cooked on open charcoal braziers, little portable fire bowls, and the buildings were made largely of wood. Fire moved through insulae the way a whisper moves through a crowd, fast and unstoppable. Augustus created a fire brigade of 7,000 men just to handle the constant blazes. 7,000 people whose entire job was running toward burning apartment towers in the middle of the night. The poet Marshall once recorded watching a 7-story insula collapse during dinner. Not a fire, not a storm, just gravity winning an argument the building had been losing for years. So what did a family's life actually look like inside one of these buildings? You shared everything. A typical upper-floor apartment was 2 small rooms. That was it. In those 2 rooms lived a family, often with elderly parents, sometimes with a lodger or 2 whose rent helped cover the cost, sometimes with an apprentice learning the family trade. The historian Glenn Story, who studied Roman residential life extensively, estimated that a typical insula could hold over 40 people in roughly 3,600 square feet of living space. That is less than 90 square feet per person. To give you a sense of scale, a modern American parking space is about 160 square feet. So yes, less space than a parking spot. There was no bedroom, there was no dining room. The same surface where you ate was where the children slept. The same corner where you stored your grain was where grandmother sat every morning to comb her hair. Everything happened in the same room at the same time in front of everyone. And here is the part that I find quietly extraordinary. This was not considered suffering. It was just life. The closeness, the noise, the warmth, the smell of other people was the texture of existence. You were never alone. You were never meant to be alone. The concept of needing quiet, needing solitude, needing a door you could close on the world that simply had not been invented yet. Now let's jump forward about 1,000 years. Out of Rome, out of the cities and into the English countryside, the Middle Ages. Most people in medieval Europe did not live in towns. They lived in small farming villages, clusters of a few dozen families surrounded by fields and forests, governed by local lords and shaped almost entirely by the seasons. These were the peasants, not the romantic peasants of fairy tales, mind you. Real ones. People who worked from before sunrise to after sunset, who paid 1/10 of everything they grew to the church, who needed permission from their lord just to get married, and who lived in homes that, well, let me describe them to you. The typical peasant house in medieval England was a single room. Rectangular, roughly the size of a generous studio apartment, historians estimate around 600 to 1,500 square feet. For the larger ones, though many smaller homes barely reached 200. Walls made of wattle and daub that is a woven lattice of sticks plastered over with a mix of wet soil, clay and animal manure. A thatched roof above. a dirt floor below, usually covered with rushes or straw that got changed occasionally. Not frequently, but occasionally. In the centre of that single room, a fire. Not a fireplace. Not a hearth built into the wall with a proper chimney. Just a fire burning in the middle of the floor with no place for the smoke to go except eventually out through a hole in the roof. Which meant that on a cold, wet day in December, when the thatch was damp and the hole was partially blocked, the smoke had nowhere to go. It just filled the room. Historians have noted that many medieval peasants had chronically irritated eyes and lungs from a lifetime of breathing that air. It was one of the leading causes of respiratory illness in the era, but you endured it. Because the fire was everything. It was warmth. It was the only way to cook. It was the thing that kept you alive through an English winter. You did not turn off the fire. You banked it at night, covered it carefully with ash so it smouldered slowly, because relighting it from scratch was genuinely difficult and time-consuming. The fire was a living thing in the household, almost a member of the family, and it burned day and night, season after season. Now, about those animals. One of the things that surprises modern readers most about medieval peasant homes is what else lived inside them. In the colder months, and sometimes year-round for the smaller animals, the family's livestock came inside too. Chickens, pigs, sometimes a cow. In Northern Europe, where winters were brutal, a longhouse design was common, humans at one end, animals at the other, with only a rough partition between them. The animals' body heat contributed to warming the space. In exchange, the family got to listen to chickens at 4 a.m, and smell what chickens produce at 4 a.m. A third of the floor space in many peasant huts was, according to archaeological evidence, partitioned off for livestock. A third, in a house that might only be 300 square feet to begin with. 100 square feet of that belonged to the pig and the cow. Furniture was minimal. A wooden table, a few stools, chairs were a luxury, a chest for storing precious things, bedding made of straw stuffed into sacks. Everyone slept in the same room, often on the same pile of bedding arranged by rank and age parents, closest to the fire children, further out any servants or workers at the edges. There was no concept of going to your room. There was no room. There was only the room. And yet, and this is where it gets interesting, if you had asked a medieval peasant family whether they felt cramped, whether they felt their privacy was violated, whether they wished they could be more alone, they would have looked at you like you had asked whether they wished they could breathe less air. The question would not have made sense. Because privacy, as we understand it, the deep, almost instinctual belief that a person deserves a space that is entirely their own, sealed off from the world, that belief is not ancient. It is not natural. It is not built into us from birth. It was invented, slowly, gradually, by a particular set of historical forces in a particular time and place. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. What I want you to sit with as you settle in tonight is this image. A single room. Firelight dancing on low wooden beams. A family of 7 sharing 3 square meters of sleeping space breath rising in the cold air. Outside, the village is dark and silent. A pig shifts in the corner. Someone coughs. A child murmurs in their sleep and rolls closer to their mother. And in that closeness, in that impossible lack of privacy, in that constant, unavoidable togetherness, there is something that a lot of us lying alone in our big modern beds tonight might quietly recognize as something we are missing. Connection. The kind that does not require a text message or a notification. The kind that is just there, breathing, warm, present. The room that was everything held more than 4 walls and a fire. It held a whole world, and now that we know what that world looked like on the outside, the stone, the smoke, the straw, I want to take you to something far more intimate. The bed. Because nothing in the history of family life tells us more about power status, love, and the strange evolution of human closeness than the history of where people slept and who they slept next to. And some of what you're about to hear is going to make you look at your own bedroom in a completely different way. Now, before we leave the world of shared rooms and follow the story somewhere else, there is something we need to talk about first. Something that when you really think about it tells you more about the social order of the pre-modern world than almost anything else. Not a law, not a battle, not the rise and fall of an empire, a piece of furniture, specifically the most important piece of furniture in any household that had one. The thing that was mentioned in wills. The thing that nobles travelled with carrying across the country on wagons when they moved from one estate to another. The thing that in the hands of the wealthy was decorated with carved oak posts, velvet curtains embroidered in gold thread feather mattresses, layered 5 deep canopies of tasselled silk that cost more than a working craftsman earned in a year. The thing that in the hands of the poor was a sack stuffed with straw on a dirt floor. The bed. Let me tell you what a bed actually meant in medieval and early modern Europe. Not what it means now, a place you sleep, a piece of furniture you chose from a catalogue and assembled on a Sunday afternoon. What it meant then. What it communicated about you the moment a visitor stepped through your door and saw it. In the 14th and 15th centuries, historians who have studied household inventories from the period note consistently that beds and their accessories, the mattresses, the hangings, the sheets, the coverlets, were among the most frequently and most lovingly described items in wills. A well-off medieval family might have 1 feather bed, 1 feather bolster, and a matched set of linen sheets to pass down, described in careful detail named for their recipients. The very poorest people left no bed at all in their wills because they had none. They had slept their whole lives on a straw pallet or a folded cloak on the floor, and they would die as they had lived, leaving nothing of it behind. Between these extremes, the bed was a precise and readable indicator of exactly where you stood in the world. Think about what went into a genuinely fine medieval bed. First, the bedstead itself, the wooden frame which in a modest household might be simple, rope-strung planks, but in a wealthy one was carved oak, or walnut raised on a platform to keep the sleeper above the cold air that pooled on the floor. Then the mattress, not 1 but several stacked layers. At the bottom, a straw-stuffed base called a palliasse. Above it a flock mattress filled with carded wool. And at the top, for those who could afford it, the crowning luxury, a feather bed. A great quilted sack of soft downy feathers, the kind of sleeping surface that seemed to swallow you gently and hold you in warmth. Over all of this sheets of fine bleached linen, a coverlet sometimes embroidered, sometimes edged with fur, ermine for the king, squirrel for the merely affluent. Then the curtains, not decorative but functional, drawn close around the sleeper to trap warmth and block the draughts that poured through the unglazed windows and the gaps in the stone walls of even the grandest houses. Heavy velvet curtains embroidered with the family's colours or symbols, turning the bed itself into a small sealed room within the larger room, and above it all the canopy, the tester, a fabric ceiling suspended from the bedposts or from ceiling beams completing the enclosure. When this was done well, when all the elements were properly assembled, the medieval great bed was not just a sleeping place. It was a statement, a declaration of prosperity and lineage that visitors to your home were meant to see and understand. Here is the detail I find most extraordinary in many medieval and early modern households. The finest bed was not kept in the bedroom. It was kept downstairs, in the hall or the parlour, wherever guests would see it first, because the point was precisely that it should be seen. The best bed was a piece of display furniture before it was a piece of sleeping furniture. You showed it to visitors. You received guests while sitting in it. Important conversations were conducted at its side. Business was sometimes done there. Life, the whole public ceremony of living, moved through the bedroom in ways that made the modern concept of a private sleeping chamber entirely alien. Let me give you one specific example that captures this perfectly, and which has generated 4 centuries of scholarly argument. In April of 1616, William Shakespeare signed his last will and testament on what scholars believe was his actual deathbed. In that will, he distributed his considerable estate land houses, money theatre shares primarily to his eldest daughter Susanna. His wife of 34 years, Anne Hathaway, received a single specific bequest: his second best bed. For over 200 years, scholars read this as a devastating insult. The man who wrote some of the most beautiful love poetry in the English language, dismissing his wife at the end with a piece of furniture that was by definition not the best one. The coldness of it seemed calculated, cruel. But here is what those scholars did not understand about beds. In Elizabethan England, the best bed in a household was kept for guests. It was the prestige bed, the display bed, the one in the most prominent room where visitors would be received and shown. It was not the bed the family actually slept in. It was in some sense a public bed, a social performance object. The second best bed was different. The second best bed was where the family slept, where the couple lay at night, where children were born, and where the intimacies of a long marriage accumulated over decades. It was the domestic bed, the personal bed, the one that held in its oak frame and worn feather mattress the actual texture of a life shared between 2 people. Scholars who have re-examined Shakespeare's will in recent decades now believe that leaving Anne the second best bed was not a slight but a tender gesture. He was leaving her specifically the bed they had slept in together for 30 years, the bed with their history in it. When the poet Carol Ann Duffy imagined Anne Hathaway's perspective on this bequest, she wrote of the marriage bed as a spinning world of forests, castles, torchlight cliff-tops, seas, the whole of a life contained in a mattress. The bed knew everything, and to bequeath it was to say this was ours. Now the question of who owned the bed in a medieval or early modern household is also inevitably a question of who owned the space around it. And this brings us to something fascinating, because the bed curtains that enclosed the finest medieval and Tudor beds were not just insulation. They were the only privacy available in a world that had almost none. In a society where rooms served multiple functions, where servants slept in the same chamber as their masters, where children and guests and members of the household moved freely through every space at almost every hour, the thick curtains drawn around a four-poster bed created a small sealed world. A room within a room. The only space in the entire household where two people could be genuinely alone. This was understood. The historian Lucy Worsley, who has written brilliantly about the social history of domestic life, notes that sleeping alone in one of these grand 16th century beds would have been a rather lonely experience, which tells you by implication exactly what they were designed for. They were made for togetherness. The curtains were drawn around a couple or a family. The warmth and darkness inside them was collective. Even the small private world of the bed was, ultimately, a shared space. Can I ask you something? If you could design the perfect private space, the one place in your life that was truly sealed from the world, what would it look like, I ask? Because the answer has changed so dramatically over the centuries. For most of human history, the answer was a curtain, a heavy velvet curtain around a wooden frame that your grandparents probably slept in before you. That was it. That was the maximum available privacy. A curtain. And it was enough. It had to be. And not everyone had even that much. For the vast majority of people, the peasants and labourers and servants and craftspeople, who made up roughly 90% of the population, the bed was not a four-poster with velvet curtains. It was a straw pallet, a rope-strung wooden frame with a rough mattress. At the very bottom of the social scale, it was nothing at all, a folded cloak, a pile of rushes, the floor itself. These people slept not in sealed private chambers, but in the same room where they worked and ate and lived. And they slept together. Not just husband and wife, but children, grandparents, occasionally servants, and in the most practical arrangements, sometimes guests as well. When a traveller arrived at a peasant cottage seeking shelter for the night, the custom was to make room. The outer edge of the family sleeping arrangement shifted outward. You moved over. This brings us to the most unusual sleeping custom that emerged from the collision of limited resources, genuine social warmth and parental anxiety about the next generation. The practice was called bundling, and it was by any modern reckoning spectacularly strange. Here is how it worked. A young man would come calling on a young woman he was courting. The distances between farms in colonial New England or rural Wales or the Pennsylvania Dutch country were substantial. A journey of several hours riding in autumn darkness was not something you made twice in one evening just to observe the proprietors. So the young man would be invited to stay the night, in the same bed as the girl, not secretly, not illicitly, under the watchful eye of her parents who were in the same room or the next one, and who had arranged the entire thing themselves. The young couple would be put to bed fully clothed. Between them would be placed either a long wooden board running the length of the mattress called a bundling board, or a large central bolster, or the most elaborate versions, the young woman would be tied into a kind of heavy cloth sack from the waist down, making any illicit movement essentially impossible. Then the parents would go to sleep, and the young couple would talk, in the dark, in bed together. Separated by a board and several layers of clothing, they would whisper through the night, getting to know each other in the particular intimacy that darkness and enforced stillness creates, the kind of conversation that does not happen in a parlour in daylight with everyone watching. The Reverend Samuel Peters, writing in 1781, defended the practice with remarkable bluntness. "I am no advocate for temptation, yet must say that bundling has prevailed 160 years in New England, and I verily believe with 10 times more chastity than the sitting on a sofa." The sitting on a sofa apparently being more dangerous. Did it always work? No, honestly it did not. Historians who have compared marriage records with birth records from colonial New England note that somewhere between 30 and 40% of brides in the late 18th century were already pregnant on their wedding day. Washington Irving, writing about the custom in 1809, pointed out dryly that wherever bundling prevailed, there was an impressive number of sturdy children born annually. The poem that circulated at the time was less diplomatic. A bundling couple went to bed with all their clothes from foot to head. That the defence might seem complete, each one was wrapped in a sheet. But oh, this bundling such a witch, the man of her did catch the itch, and so provoked was the wretch that she of him a bastard catched. So, not a perfect system. But here is what I find genuinely worth reflecting on in this peculiar custom setting, aside its obvious comedic potential. Bundling was a society's attempt to solve a problem that modern life has almost entirely eliminated. How do you let two young people discover whether they actually like each other, when they live far apart, have almost no unsupervised time together, and the rules of propriety require them to be formally chaperoned at all other moments? The answer worked out by practical people in cold New England farmhouses was put them in a bed with a board between them and let them talk in the dark until they figure it out. There is something about this that strikes me as genuinely wise under all the strangeness. The understanding that real knowledge of another person is built in intimacy in the lowered guard of nighttime conversation, in the kind of exchange that happens when you are warm and tired and the public face has dissolved and it is just two people in the dark being honest with each other. The bundling board, ridiculous as it sounds, was acknowledging something true, that the bed is not just a place to sleep. It is a place where people reveal themselves. And this is what connects the luxurious Tudor four-poster with its 6 layers of mattress and its gold-embroidered curtains to the Pennsylvania farmhouse, with its board and its bundling bag and its watchful parents in the next room to the medieval peasant pallet, where a whole family lay pressed together for warmth. In all of these places across all these centuries, the bed was never simply about sleep. It was about who you trusted enough to be near in the dark. And now that we have understood what the bed meant, who owned it, what it said about you, what happened in it and around it and beside it, the story asks to expand. Because the bed was not the only place where the pre-modern world required you to share yourself with strangers. In fact, some of the most revealing moments in the entire history of communal life happen not in homes at all, but on the road, in the inns and taverns and way-houses that lined the routes between places, where the question of who you slept next to was not decided by family or custom or a bundling board, but by whoever else happened to arrive at the same establishment on the same evening, and where on one particular September night in 1776, Two of the most important men in American history found themselves sharing a single bed in a room with one small window and argued about whether or not to open it. There is a story I keep coming back to, not because it is dramatic, not because it changed the course of history, but because of how perfectly ordinary it was at the time and how utterly strange it sounds to us today. September the 9th, 1776. The American Revolution is weeks old. George Washington's army has just barely survived a catastrophic defeat on Long Island, and the Continental Congress is scrambling desperate for any chance to stop a full-scale war before it devours everything they have built. So they send 3 men on a diplomatic mission from Philadelphia, north towards Staten Island to negotiate with the British Admiral Richard Howe, not because anyone truly believed it would work, but because they had to try. The 3 men are Benjamin Franklin, 70 years old, the elder statesman of the Revolution; John Adams, 41, already known for being the most argumentative man in any room he entered; and Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, the youngest of the group at just 26. They travel by horse and carriage for hours through summer heat and dust, passing ragged columns of soldiers headed south toward battle. Adams writes in his diary about watching these men straggling along the road, he does not seem inspired. When they finally reach the town of New Brunswick in New Jersey, it is late. They are tired, hungry, and the inns are packed. There are only 2 rooms left. Rutledge, being either the luckiest or the cleverest of the 3, somehow secures a room to himself. That leaves Franklin and Adams to share a single room, barely large enough to contain the bed inside it, with no fireplace and 1 small window. And here is where the story gets wonderful. John Adams, being the kind of man who fretted endlessly about his health, immediately moved to shut the window. The night air, he was convinced, would make him ill. This was a genuinely held belief in the 18th century, the idea that cold air at night carried disease, that draughts caused fevers, that an open window was an invitation to sickness. Franklin, being Benjamin Franklin, said absolutely not. According to Adams's own diary, the old man launched into what Adams described as an harangue, a full lecture delivered from his half of the bed at somewhere past 10 o'clock at night, on the nature of respiration, fresh air, the causes of the common cold, and why everything Adams believed about open windows was wrong. Franklin argued that the air inside the room was already worse than anything drifting through the window. He argued with the confidence of a man who had spent decades studying electricity and fluid dynamics and apparently ventilation. Adams, to his credit, wrote that he was so entertained by the lecture that he fell asleep before it ended. The window stayed open. Neither man caught a cold. I love this story for many reasons, but what strikes me most is not the argument itself. It is the utter casualness of the whole thing. 2 of the most important men in the founding of the United States, one of whom would become the 2nd president, sharing a bed in a cramped New Jersey inn without a second thought. Not because they were close friends. They were in fact often at odds, but because that is simply what you did when you travelled in 1776. You shared a bed with whoever happened to be in the room. There was no alternative. There was no awkwardness about it. The awkwardness, if any, came from arguing about the window, not from the sleeping arrangement itself. Think about that for a moment. How much has our idea of personal space shifted since then? Because this was not exceptional. This was completely, utterly normal. When you travelled in colonial America or anywhere in pre-industrial Europe, you did not book a private room. A private room was a luxury available only to the very wealthy, and even then it was not always offered. At most inns and taverns, the standard arrangement was a shared room, a shared bed, and an expectation that you would be civil about it. The travel writer Alexander Hamilton, not the Alexander Hamilton, but a Scottish doctor travelling through the American Northeast in 1744, kept a detailed diary of his journey. He describes one night bunking with 3 complete strangers, 2 large men with long black beards and a young boy. Another night he turned in early, only to lie awake for 3 hours because the other guests in his room simply would not stop talking. He does not describe this as a violation. He describes it as annoying. There is a difference. The rules of the road, such as they were, went something like this: if you share a bed with a stranger, you stay on your side. You do not hog the blankets. You do not fidget excessively. You do not bring your boots into the bed. In rural areas, 6 people to a single bed was not unheard of. The historian A. Roger E. Kirch, who spent decades researching the history of night and sleep, documented these arrangements in meticulous detail. He found that families at home had their own system too. Children arranged by age and gender on either side of the parents, with the youngest closest to the mother for warmth, older children toward the edges. If a guest arrived and needed a place to sleep, they went on the outside. That was the rule, outside. And I want to pause here and ask you something genuinely. Does any part of you feel a pang of something when you hear that? Not the 6 to a bed part necessarily, we can let that one go, but the idea that when a stranger arrived exhausted at your door, they just slipped into the household, into the warmth of it. No hotel key, no separate entrance, no carefully maintained distance. Just here is a spot. Here is a blanket. Be quiet and do not fidget. There was an entire social language built around sharing sleep with people you did not know, and it lasted for centuries. Now I need to tell you about a bed. Not just any bed. A very specific bed currently sitting in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, England, where it has been since 1931. It is made of richly carved oak. It is 10 feet long and 11 feet wide. It has 4 posts and an elaborate canopy, and it is approximately the size of 2 modern king beds pushed together. It is called the Great Bed of Ware. It was built around 1590 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I for a specific inn in the town of Ware, Hertfordshire in England, and scholars at the Victoria and Albert Museum believe it was built as an advertisement, a spectacle, a conversation piece, a gimmick to draw travellers off the road and through the inn's door. Come see the giant bed. Come sleep in the giant bed. Tell your friends you slept in the giant bed. It worked. The Great Bed of Ware became famous enough that Shakespeare referenced it in his play Twelfth Night, written around 1601. Sir Toby Belch uses it as a measuring stick for something impossibly large, which tells us the bed was already a well-known cultural landmark within a decade of its creation. Ben Jonson also mentioned it. Christopher Marlowe's name is carved into the headboard, along with dozens of other visitors who apparently felt so moved by the experience that they took a penknife to the woodwork. And in 1689, this is the detail I cannot get out of my head, 26 butchers and their wives, a total of 52 people, are reported to have spent a night in the great bed of Ware together. 52 people in one bed. Now, I will be honest with you, historians debate whether the 52 people story is exactly true or something that grew in the telling. But the fact that it was told, the fact that this was the kind of story that circulated about a popular inn-bed, tells us everything about how differently people related to shared sleep. It was not a source of shame or discomfort. It was a point of pride, a party, a story worth repeating. This is the world that existed for most of human history, and the people living in it were not somehow less refined, less intelligent, less dignified than we are. They were just operating under a completely different set of assumptions about where a person ends and another begins. There was no classical Latin word for privacy. The scholar Georges Duby, who spent his career studying the history of private life in medieval Europe, pointed this out directly. The Latin word privatio did not mean what we mean when we say privacy. It meant something taken away. An absence, a loss. The idea that one might actively want to be separated from others, that solitude was desirable, that a room of one's own was a right, was not simply unavailable to most people. It was conceptually strange. Now there were gradations, of course. Even in the most communal sleeping arrangements, people understood the difference between public and private in certain ways. The inns of medieval England operated on a kind of sliding scale, the common hall at the bottom, where servants and the very poor might sleep on the floor on rushes with a rope strung at chest height, for them to drape their arms over and doze upright. Then the shared rooms with mattresses, several strangers to a bed. Then, for those who could afford it, a room with fewer strangers, and at the very top a private chamber, sometimes with a curtained bed, where you might sleep with only your travelling companion or your spouse. That curtain was doing a lot of work. For most of history, a curtain around a bed was not decoration. It was the closest thing available to a door. It kept out draughts, it kept in warmth, and it gave the illusion at least of a small sealed world inside the larger shared one. The 17th century diarist Samuel Pepys, who wrote about everything because he was that kind of person, regularly noted sharing beds with male friends when they visited. He even rated them. One of his favourites was a man he called the Merry Mr. Creed, whom Pepys described as providing excellent company. This was not unusual for Pepys to mention. It was not remarkable. It was just something you noted the way you might today note whether someone was a good dinner guest. So what changed? How did we get from a world where two founding fathers could share a bed without anyone raising an eyebrow, to a world where the idea of sharing a hotel room with a colleague is considered either a significant inconvenience or a subject for comedy? The short answer is money cities and the Victorians. But the long answer, the one that gets really interesting, involves a shift not just in architecture or economics, but in what we believed a person fundamentally was. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as the Industrial Revolution began reshaping cities and creating a new middle class with new kinds of houses, a new idea started to take hold, that a person's inner life was separate from the world around them, that you needed physical space in order to have psychological space. That being visible to others was in some essential way a vulnerability. Before this, being surrounded by people, even sleeping surrounded by people, was simply the texture of being alive. After this, it began to feel like exposure, and here is the part I find genuinely moving and a little unsettling. We made this shift so completely that we have forgotten we made it at all. Most of us alive today were born into a world where having your own bedroom was assumed, and where sharing a bed with someone outside your immediate partnership was either a sign of financial hardship or a comedic premise. We have built entire architectural industries, entire philosophical frameworks, entire ideas about mental health and selfhood around the premise that a person needs private space, needs it, not as a luxury, but as a basic requirement. And I am not here to argue that we were wrong to want this. Privacy has its genuine gifts. There is something real and valuable about a door you can close, a space that belongs to you, a room where the world cannot follow. But I think it is worth sitting with the fact that for most of human history almost no one had this. And the world did not end. People found love and raised families and made art and built civilizations, all while sleeping in rooms full of strangers, all while knowing that the person next to them would hear their first cough of the morning and the last prayer they murmured at night. There was a cost to the communal world we lost, a texture of life that does not translate easily into our vocabulary of wellness and personal space. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you find yourself in a hotel room alone wondering why you feel vaguely disconnected from everything you might think of Adams and Franklin arguing about a window in New Jersey, while the fate of a nation hung somewhere in the dark outside. 2 men, 1 bed, 1 very small window. The whole world just beyond it. Now that we have spent time in these spaces where people rested their bodies, the rooms that held entire lives, the beds that held entire families and sometimes entire strangers, it is time to follow our noses to a different kind of shared space, the kitchen. Or rather, the place in the house that was never quite a kitchen and never quite a living room and never quite a workshop, because it was all of those things at once. Because the story of how people cooked, how they fed each other, what they ate, what they refused to eat, and who got to decide turns out to be one of the most revealing windows into how families actually worked, who held real power inside the walls of a home, and what was at stake when a meal came together over an open fire. Something happened when chimneys were invented that almost nobody talks about. It sounds like such a small thing, a hole in the wall, a tube of brick pointing at the sky. But the chimney, which arrived properly in European homes somewhere around the 14th century, did not just solve a smoke problem. It quietly dismantled one of the oldest social structures in human history. Because before the chimney, before the fire moved to the wall, the fire was in the centre of the room, and everything was arranged around it. Let me take you back a few thousand years. Not to the Middle Ages yet, but further. Ancient Greece, around the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, when Homer was writing his great epics. In those stories in the halls of Odysseus on Ithaca, in the feasting rooms of kings, you keep encountering the same image, the central hearth. A raised stone platform fire burning at the top, sitting in the very middle of the room, smoke rising toward the open roof above. This was not just a design choice, it was a cosmology. The Greeks had a goddess specifically for this fire. Her name was Hestia. Her name literally means hearth. It is the same root reaching back through thousands of years of language as our word Hospital, our word host, our word hospitality. She was one of the original 12 Olympians, and she was the only one who never left the fire. While Zeus hurled lightning and Athena fought wars, Hestia stayed put. She kept the flame, and in return, the Greeks gave her first and last honour at every meal, every sacrifice, every gathering. Before you ate, you offered to Hestia. Before you drank, you offered to Hestia. When the Romans adopted the Greek gods as their own, they renamed her Vesta, and they took her so seriously that they built her a temple in the Roman Forum staffed by 6 priestesses, the Vestal Virgins, whose sole sacred duty was to tend her flame and never let it go out. If the flame of Vesta died, the Romans believed Rome itself was in danger. Think about what that means for a moment. Not as superstition, as metaphor. The fire at the centre of the house was so fundamental to everything, to warmth, to food, to gathering, to life itself, that its extinguishing was not just a household inconvenience. It was a sign that something essential had broken, that the heart of the community had gone cold. And here is the thing about that metaphor, it was not wrong. Because for most of human history, the fire at the centre of the home was quite literally everything. Let me walk you through a day in a medieval peasant household somewhere in England around the year 1300. Roughly 700 years ago. You wake before the sun comes up, which at this time of year in late autumn means waking in complete darkness. The first thing you do, even before you fully open your eyes, is check the fire. Because if the fire has gone out overnight, your day begins with a crisis. Reigniting a fire from nothing with flint and steel on cold tinder in a damp English morning could take an hour or more. So the careful peasant always banked the fire before sleeping, raked the hot ashes over the remaining embers, smothered it just enough to slow the burning, kept the core alive through the night like a carefully tended ember of hope. Most mornings the fire is still there, a faint orange glow under the grey ash. You feed it carefully, dry wood patience, gentle breath, and it grows. Within minutes, the single room fills with the smell of wood smoke and something else, whatever is in the pot. Because there is always something in the pot. This is one of my favourite details from medieval food history, and I want to spend a moment with it, because it tells you so much about how shared life actually worked. Medieval peasant families, at least those who had enough to eat, often kept what historians call a pottage pot going on the fire more or less continuously. Pottage was a thick stew of grains and root vegetables, sometimes enriched with scraps of salted pork or a bone, sometimes flavoured with whatever herbs grew in the cottage garden. It was the medieval equivalent of the perpetual fridge clean-out. Whatever was available went in. Whatever had just been harvested came in. The pot was rarely emptied entirely, only once a year, traditionally in the weeks before Lent, when the church required fasting from meat, and the pot was cleaned and started fresh. The rest of the time, the pot just kept going. Day after day, the same pot replenished, stirred, tasted. The food historian Ray Tannehill described it beautifully. The cauldron was the original stock pot, providing what she called an ever-changing broth, enriched daily with whatever was available. The taste of last week's hare might still be there underneath the flavour of today's cabbage. The memory of a good harvest lingered in the stock. Is that strange to us? Yes. Is it also somehow deeply comforting? I think so. There is something almost living about a pot of food that never completely ends. Something that says this household is fed, this fire is burning, this family is going to be okay. Now I want to pause here and ask you something. When you think of cooking, when you picture the act of making a meal, where do you picture it happening? In your mind, is it one person in the kitchen, maybe two? Is there a specific set of appliances involved? A counter, a stove, a refrigerator? I ask because for most of human history, cooking was not private. It was not individual. It was not a task with a beginning, a middle and an end that one person performed and then cleaned up after. Cooking was woven into the fabric of communal life in a way that is almost impossible to fully imagine from where we stand today. In medieval villages, the largest and most critical piece of cooking infrastructure was not inside any individual home. It was shared. The village oven, a massive stone structure heated to temperature with a wood fire, then used in sequence by the whole community, was communal property. You did not bake your own bread in your own oven. Most families had no oven at all. What they had was access to the village oven on their assigned day at their assigned time. You brought your shaped loaves. You slid them in. You waited with the other women and children from neighbouring households. You talked. You gossiped, you argued over timing, and then you went home with your bread. This was the rhythm of it. The grindstone was at the mill communal, the oven was in the village communal, the well was in the square communal. Even the animals in many villages were grazed on common land that belonged to everyone and no one. The word for this in medieval England was simply the commons, and it was exactly that, a shared foundation of life. Cooking then was not something you did alone. It was something the village did together in overlapping shifts around shared resources, with the understanding that your neighbour's bread being ready depended on your bread being done on time. The kitchen was the village. The fire was everyone's fire. And then there is the central hearth itself, the one inside the house, and the social geometry it created. Here is something the archaeologist and historian Karen Bashir Metheny noted in her research in early medieval great halls, where the lord of the manor and his entire household servants' knights, guests' family ate together at long tables. The central fire was not just warmth. It was a statement about who belonged. The lord and his family sat closest to the fire at the high table. Honoured guests were seated near it too. As you moved further from the centre, further from the fire's warmth, your social status dropped. The most junior servants sat farthest out in the cold draughts near the doors. Your proximity to the fire was a map of your place in the world. One medieval historian described it this way: the term hearth men, people who literally sat at the fire with their lord, was applied to the closest, most trusted members of the household. These were the people who shared not just the warmth, but the intimacy of the inner circle. To be invited close to the fire was a mark of real belonging. To be pushed to the edges was to be reminded that you were peripheral. This language of fire and belonging is older than medieval England, older than Rome, older than Greece. It runs through almost every human culture we have ever documented. Anthropologists who study indigenous communities around the world have noted how consistently fire functions as the gravitational centre of communal life, the place where people gather as darkness falls, where stories are told, where decisions are made, where children fall asleep listening to adults talk. The fire does not just warm the body, it creates a boundary between inside and outside, between us and the dark, between the known world and everything beyond it. Now, back to the chimney. When chimneys became standard in European homes somewhere between the 12th and 14th centuries first, in the castles of the wealthy, then slowly spreading downward through the social order, they changed the architecture of the house in ways that seem purely practical, but were in fact deeply social. The fire moved from the centre of the room to the wall, and everything rearranged itself accordingly. Ceilings could suddenly be lowered because there were no longer sparks shooting up into an open roof. Rooms could be stacked on top of each other. Actual upper floors became possible once the risk of fire was contained. The smoke went up the flue and out instead of filling the room, which meant you could have actual furniture, actual textiles, actual decoration, without everything being permanently coated in soot. All of this was undeniably an improvement, but there was something else the chimney did, something the scholars of medieval architecture have noted with a kind of quiet wistfulness. The central hearth, for all its discomforts, had created a room where everyone faced inward, where the fire was the thing you gathered around, where the arrangement of bodies around the flame was inherently communal. There was no head of the room, no corner to retreat to, no private alcove. Just a circle of people around a common centre of warmth. The wall fireplace changed that geometry completely. Now the room had a direction. The fire was on one wall and you sat facing it. You could sit apart from each other. You could be in the same room and not in the same circle. The historian researching medieval fireplaces, Eamon Duffy, touched on this when describing how the shift from central hearth to wall fireplace privatized the warmth. Sitting near the fire became something you did with a small group or alone, rather than something everyone did together. And I think this matters more than it might seem, because the physical arrangement of bodies around a fire shapes conversation. It shapes the kinds of stories that get told. A circle facing inward invites everyone to speak. A row of people all facing one direction, looking at a wall, that arrangement is more like an audience than a gathering. There is a reason we still feel something when someone lights a fire. When someone builds a campfire and people gather around it, something shifts. People sit closer than they would otherwise. Conversation opens up. Someone tells a story they would not have told in a living room under artificial light. Children fall asleep on laps. Strangers feel briefly like old friends. This is not magic. It is history. It is 10,000 years of human memory encoded somewhere underneath the thinking part of the brain that says this is what gathering is supposed to feel like. And the medieval family sitting around that central hearth, the smoke stinging their eyes, the fire warming their feet, the pottage pot bubbling with the memory of every meal they had eaten that week. They understood something about community that we have to work hard to reconstruct. They did not gather around the fire because they had read articles about the importance of family time. They gathered because there was nowhere else to be, And in that constraint, in that beautiful smoky animal constraint, was something we might now call warmth in the deepest possible sense. One more thing before we leave the fire. In ancient Greece, when a family moved, when they left one city and travelled to found a new colony far away, they did not travel empty-handed. They carried with them a portion of the sacred flame from the public hearth of their home city. They guarded it on the journey. They planted it at the centre of their new home. And from that flame everything in the new settlement was lit. The fire came first. Everything else came after. I find that extraordinarily moving. The idea that a flame could carry meaning across distances, that the thread connecting you to where you came from was not a document or a piece of land, but a living fire that someone had kept burning so you could bring it with you. What do we carry when we leave home? What thread do we try to keep burning? Now, speaking of what gets carried and what gets kept and what gets carefully passed down there, is one person in the medieval household who held more real power than almost anyone recognized. Not the lord, not the head of the family, the woman who kept the keys, because the story of who controlled food in the pre-modern home, who managed the stores, who made the ale, who held the literal and figurative keys to survival, is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in the entire history of family life, and it is almost completely invisible if you do not know where to look. Let me tell you about a myth that has been living rent-free in our heads for centuries. The myth goes something like this. Medieval peasants ate terrible food, grey, tasteless slop, watery gruel, stale bread that could double as a building material, meat so rotten it required mountains of spice to disguise the smell. That last one is especially persistent. You have probably heard it that medieval cooks used expensive spices not because they loved flavour, but because their meat was half spoiled, and the pepper was the only thing standing between dinner and a public health crisis. It is a wonderfully vivid theory. It is also almost completely wrong. And when we unpack why it is wrong, we stumble into one of the most fascinating and surprisingly moving stories about food class and daily life in the medieval world. A story that cuts right to the heart of how families ate what they shared, and what a single meal could tell you about your entire place in the universe. Let's start with what peasants actually ate. And I mean really ate, not the cartoon version of peasant suffering, but the genuine, historically documented daily diet of the people who made up roughly 90% of Europe's population for nearly 1,000 years. In 2019, a team of scientists from the University of Bristol published research that changed the conversation. They analysed food residues from ceramic cooking pots, excavated at a medieval English village called West Cotton in Northamptonshire. These were actual pots that actual families had cooked in somewhere around the 12th or 13th century, and by examining the fats and oils absorbed into the porous clay lipids that had been sitting in those walls for 800 years, they could tell with remarkable precision what had been cooked in them. The answer surprised a lot of people. Mutton and beef stews enriched with vegetables like cabbage and leek, dairy products, soft young cheeses, hearty broths made with real animal fat. These were not the meals of people eating to survive on whatever scraps they could find. This was genuine nourishment made with care from available ingredients cooked low and slow over the fire until the flavours had merged into something satisfying and deeply warming. The peasant diet was not gourmet. But it was not miserable either. The daily foundation was bread, dark, coarse, dense bread made from rye or barley, occasionally with a mix of oats and beans ground in. Wheat, the lighter and more expensive grain, was reserved almost entirely for the wealthy. The peasant loaf was chewy and filling and almost certainly pretty good in the way that good sourdough is good. Rough, honest, alive with the taste of grain. Alongside the bread came the pottage, that slow-cooked stew of legumes and vegetables and whatever else the season offered. Peas, beans, leeks, onions, cabbage, carrots, turnips, herbs from the cottage garden, parsley, thyme, rosemary, sage, garlic. Peasant cooks knew their local herbs intimately. They used them every day. And then there was ale. This requires a moment of explanation because the image of a medieval peasant drinking ale all day sounds either very fun or very bleak depending on your perspective. The reality is functional. Water sources in medieval villages were frequently contaminated, shared with animals, with runoff, with all the things that contaminated water before anyone understood germ theory. Ale, even the very weak small ale that most peasants drank, had been boiled during the brewing process. It was safer. It was also only about 1% alcohol, roughly the strength of a very light beer today. So drinking it throughout the day was the equivalent of staying hydrated, not getting drunk. Children drank it. The elderly drank it. It was simply water you could trust. Was this diet repetitive? Yes, absolutely. Was it constrained by season, by what could be grown or foraged locally, by what the Lord permitted and the weather allowed? Of course. But it was not the grey, tasteless horror of popular imagination. Here is something I love. Historians have noted that some of what medieval peasants ate regularly, simple stewed legumes with herbs, slow-cooked root vegetables, fresh dairy, dense whole-grain bread now appears on the menus of expensive farm-to-table restaurants at prices that would have baffled a 14th century farmhand. The food of necessity became 6 centuries later the food of aspiration. There is a certain historical justice in that. Now here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. Because while the peasant was eating their honest bowl of pottage seasoned with garden herbs 2 miles away in the Lord's manor, or 10 miles away in the bishop's palace, or 100 miles away in the royal court, people were eating something so different it barely belonged to the same category of human experience. And the difference was not just about quantity, it was about spectacle, philosophy, politics, and the most expensive commodities on earth. We need to talk about spices, specifically black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, saffron, nutmeg. Today I can walk into any grocery store and pick up all of these for a few dollars combined. They sit in identical little jars, alphabetically arranged on a spice rack, utterly ordinary. In the 14th and 15th centuries, these same spices were the most valuable traded commodities in the known world. Pepper was so prized it was literally called black gold, and medieval texts record it being used as currency, as tribute paid between nobles, as gifts at the level of diplomatic relations between nations. Historians at the University of Toronto, who spent decades researching medieval spice prices, found that a pound of pepper in 15th century England could cost more than 2 full days' wages for a skilled London craftsman. A pound of saffron made from the hand-harvested stigmas of crocus flowers, requiring over 200,000 individual blossoms, to produce a single pound cost orders of magnitude more. And here is the detail that absolutely floors me: approximately 1,000 tons of pepper were being imported annually into Western Europe by the 15th century. 1,000 tons. Through trade routes that stretched from the spice islands of Southeast Asia and the pepper fields of India across the Indian Ocean, through the Arab-controlled Middle East into the ports of Venice and Genoa across the Alps, to the kitchens of the wealthy all over Europe. Each pound of pepper had travelled thousands of miles, passed through dozens of intermediary merchants, each adding their cut before it arrived at a noble table. Those intermediaries, by the way, were not above adding a little mythology to justify the cost. Medieval traders spread stories about pepper trees guarded by enormous fire-breathing serpents in India, which is why the peppercorns were black. The harvesters had to burn the serpents away first. They claimed cinnamon could only be harvested from the nests of a monstrous bird called the cynomolgus, which built its nests high on impossible cliffs from cinnamon bark. The only way to get the cinnamon was to lure the bird away or throw heavy meat below the nest and hope the bird tried to carry it back and collapsed the nest. Was any of this true? Of course not. But it served its purpose. The story made the spice more exotic, more dangerous, more worth its price, and the noble paying for it got not just flavour, but a story, a whiff of the world's distant edges, proof that their wealth could reach places most people would never see. Because here is what we need to understand about spices in the medieval world: they were not primarily about taste. They were about status. They were about display. They were, in a very literal sense, edible proof of power. The medieval historian Madeleine Pellner-Cosman documented what she called the theatrical quality of noble feasting. At a great banquet, food was not served, it was staged. A roasted peacock would be redressed in its own feathers, made to look alive again, carried into the hall on a silver platter. A pie might be enormous, ornate, glazed with egg and saffron, until it gleamed gold under the torchlight. Dishes might be endored, literally gilded with real gold leaf painted onto the food. The guests were not just eating, they were watching a performance that announced unmistakably, look how much this cost, look how far this travelled, look at who you are eating with. The salt cellar is my favourite symbol from this world. At a noble table, the salt was kept in an elaborate ship-shaped container called a nef, from the French word for ship, because the container was designed to look like a sailing vessel. And the placement of the salt on the table was not incidental. You sat above the salt, or below the salt, a phrase we still use today, though most of us have forgotten where it comes from. Above the salt meant you were seated close to the host, in the zone of honour, in the territory of power. Below the salt meant the outer tables, the minor guests, the people whose presence was tolerated but not celebrated. The food itself reinforced this geography. The closer you sat to the host, the better the food in front of you. Fresh game finely spiced, served in small ornate portions. The farther out you sat, the simpler and more numerous the dishes became. The bread got coarser, the stew less rich. And here is the thing that I keep turning over in my mind: this was not accidental. It was deliberate, codified, and enforced. Medieval sumptuary laws, laws about what people were allowed to consume based on their social class, were in force across most of Europe from roughly the 13th century onward. These were actual laws with actual penalties that specified what kinds of food different ranks of society were permitted to eat. A commoner could not legally eat the same foods as a noble. Venison from the Lord's forest was off limits, and poaching could mean severe punishment. Certain refined white breads were the province of the upper classes. Fine wine was a marker of status. Even the number of courses you were permitted to serve at a celebration was regulated by law in some jurisdictions. Food was not just sustenance. Food was a system of social control. Which brings us to what might be the most surprising thing about medieval food, the emotion embedded in it. Because we look at this stratified, hierarchical, politically loaded eating culture, and it seems cold, calculating almost. The powerful displaying their power through what they ate, the powerless subsisting on what they were permitted. But inside those peasant homes, inside that daily bowl of pottage and that dark rye bread and that small ale poured from a clay jug, there was something else, something quieter and more durable than spectacle. There was the knowledge of what you had, a family that had enough pottage to share with a tired traveller passing through the village, a harvest festival where the community ate together from a common table, and the food, however simple, tasted like relief and continuity and belonging. A mother who knew every herb in her garden by name, who had learned each one from her own mother, who would teach them to her daughter, who would carry that knowledge forward across generations in the form of a pinch of thyme over a simmering pot. You know what does not appear much in the historical record of noble feasting warmth? Connection. The feeling of sitting around a fire with people you love eating something that someone made for you out of care rather than performance. And maybe that is the real divide. Not pepper versus pottage, not gold leaf versus rye bread, but the difference between food as theatre and food as love. I wonder sometimes honestly which of those two traditions we have inherited. Now before we leave the question of who ate what and why, there is something lurking just behind all of this that I have been waiting to get to. Something that takes everything we have talked about, the shared spaces, the communal fire, the food, as a marker of who you were in the world, and puts it through the strange and funny and sometimes heartbreaking lens of the calendar. Because in medieval Europe, what you ate was not just determined by your class or your harvest. It was determined for roughly 1/3 of the year by a force that had nothing to do with hunger at all. And that force had opinions about beaver. So we have established that the peasant's pottage was honest nourishing, and when the herbs were right, and the fire had been burning all day, probably quite good. But now I want to take you to the other end of the table, not just the other end of the social hierarchy, literally the other end of the same table. Because the medieval Great Hall was in many ways the most honest visual representation of how a society understood itself that has ever existed. It did not pretend that people were equal. It did not hide its hierarchies behind polite fictions. It arranged them in a room, seated them in order, and served them food that announced unmistakably and publicly exactly where each person stood in the world. And at the far end of that room, at the high table on its raised platform looking out over the long hall below, was a meal so different from what the peasant ate at home that the two might as well have belonged to entirely separate civilizations. Let me tell you what a medieval nobleman's feast actually looked like. Not the sanitized version from textbooks, and not the Hollywood version with its comically oversized turkey legs. The real version reconstructed from account books, cookery manuscripts, and the surviving records of households that took enormous pride in documenting exactly what they spent and what they served. A serious noble feast in 14th or 15th century England might run to a dozen courses or more. The evening began with light dishes called potages. Not the peasant's pottage, but refined, strained, spiced preparations, bearing the same name and almost nothing else in common with it. These were followed by roasted meats, not mutton or pork, which were the commons fare, venison from the Lord's private hunting ground, wild boar, pheasant, partridge, swan, yes, swan. And the way the swan was served tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between food and power in the medieval world. The bird was roasted. Then it was carefully skinned, the feathers set aside. Then once the meat was cooked, the skin was replaced. The feathers were reassembled. The neck was propped up with a wire so it curved gracefully, and the whole creation was carried into the great hall on a silver platter by a procession of servants looking to the assembled guests exactly as though it had just been brought in alive. This was not food. This was theatre. The food historian Ken Albala, who has spent his career studying medieval and Renaissance cuisine, put it simply. Feasts of the Middle Ages weren't just meals, they were theatre symbolism and power on display. Every dish told a story about the host. Every ingredient communicated something about his reach, his wealth, his connections to the wider world. A roasted peacock redressed in its feathers and brought to the table with its gilded beak glinting in the torchlight was saying, as clearly as a speech could have said it, I have the resources to feed you this. I have the power to provide this spectacle. Do you understand what that means? And the guests understood completely. Now 2 things made this theatre possible. One was the hunting rights. I mentioned earlier the fact that venison and certain game birds were legally the preserve of the noble class alone, so their presence on a table instantly communicated status that could not simply be bought. And the second was something I want to spend real time on because it shaped not just medieval feasting, but the entire course of world history. Spices. We talked about spices already briefly in the context of what the poor could not afford. But now let's look at them from the noble's perspective, from the perspective of the person who could afford them and for whom they served a purpose that went far beyond making food taste good. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, saffron. Today I can buy all of these for a few pounds at any grocery store lined up in identical jars sorted alphabetically. The complete normalcy of this is something our ancestors would have found incomprehensible. In 14th and 15th century England, a pound of black pepper cost more than 2 full days' wages for a skilled London craftsman. Saffron made from the hand-harvested stigmas of crocus flowers, requiring over 200,000 blossoms to produce a single pound, cost more than the pepper. And these spices has travelled every single one of them from the other side of the known world. From the spice islands of the East Indies, from the pepper fields of India, from the saffron fields of Persia, all the way through the Arab-controlled trade routes of the Middle East, through the merchant cities of Venice and Genoa, across the Alps, and down the roads of Europe to the kitchen of a lord in Lincolnshire or Burgundy or Castile. Each pinch of pepper carried that entire journey with it. Each spoonful of saffron represented months of trade negotiations, weeks of transport, the profit margins of a dozen intermediaries. When a medieval nobleman used saffron to turn his egg tarts golden, he was not simply seasoning food. He was displaying the fact that his wealth could reach across the world and pull its flavours back to his table. More than 75% of the recipes in 13th to 15th century European cookery manuscripts, the cookbooks written for and used by noble and wealthy households, contain spices. In English manuscripts, the proportion rises above 90%. This was not because medieval cooks were simply fond of strong flavours. It was because spice was the single most visible and legible marker of affluence available in the kitchen. You could taste the cost of the meal in every bite. And this brings us to a small object on the medieval table that I find in its own quiet way one of the most eloquent symbols of the entire social order of the period, the nef. The nef was a salt cellar. But to call it simply a salt cellar is rather like calling Notre Dame Cathedral a building with a roof. The great medieval nefs, and there are examples surviving in museums across Europe, were made of silver or gold, often further embellished with enamel and jewels. Their form was a ship in elaborate and faithful detail, masts and sails, sailors visible on the deck, ropes and rigging picked out in fine metal work, a nautilus shell, that rare and beautiful natural curiosity sometimes forming the hull. The nef was placed on the table in front of the most important person seated there. It held the salt, and its position on the table, that single gleaming ship-shaped object, divided the room into two social territories as clearly as any wall could have done. Sit close to it between it and the head of the table, and you were above the salt, an honoured guest, a person of consequence, the Lord's inner circle. Sit on the other side of it, further down the table toward the door, and you were below the salt, less important, present at the Lord's pleasure, but not at his right hand. The phrase which we still use today, we still say someone is below the salt. When we mean they are of lower status, that phrase comes directly from this physical arrangement of bodies and cutlery in medieval great halls. Think about that. A turn of phrase in our mouths right now in the 21st century is a direct descendant of the sight of a silver ship-shaped salt cellar on a long table in a 14th century English castle. Language carries the past in it, whether we know it or not. And now I want to draw your attention to something that I find quietly remarkable about all of this. Something that cuts underneath the spectacle and the gold leaf and the redressed peacocks and asks a harder question. Who was in the hall when all of this happened? Not just the noble's family and honoured guests, not just the knights and the stewards and the visiting dignitaries. The household servants were there. They moved through the feast, carrying dishes, pouring wine, clearing plates. They watched the whole performance from the edges. They served food they would never themselves eat to people whose lives were structured around the explicit assumption that such abundance was their natural due. And then, and this is the detail that gets to me every time when the noble family retired after the feast, the servants gathered the used trenchers. The trenchers were the thick slabs of stale bread that had served as plates throughout the meal, absorbing the juices and sauces of all those spiced and gilded dishes. And these used bread plates were collected and distributed to the poor at the castle gate or to the dogs, the scraps of the feast, literally the containers that the feast had been served on. That was what filtered down. The medieval banquet historian Constance Berman described the feast as a performance of social order, and she is exactly right. But what performance theory sometimes underweights is how that performance felt from the cheaper seats, from below the salt, from the gate where the poor waited for the trenchers. I am not saying this to condemn the medieval noble. He was a product of his world as we are all products of ours. And there were genuine moments of communal participation in these feasts. There were feast days when the Lord was expected to feed his tenants, when the hierarchy loosened and the hall expanded to include people who were not usually welcome at the high table. Food in the medieval world moved in two directions: up as tribute and tax, and down as hospitality and charity. Both movements were real and both were obligatory, but the fundamental architecture of the table, the silver nef at the centre, the seating arranged by rank, the food calibrated so precisely to your social station that a stranger could have looked at anyone's plate and read their position in the world within seconds. That architecture is one of the most honest documents the Middle Ages left us. It said in the most direct possible terms, this is how we understand ourselves. This is the order we have built. These are the people who matter sitting above the salt. These are the people who matter less sitting below it. And this is what that difference costs to feed. Food had never been only about nourishment. In the medieval world, this truth was simply more openly acknowledged than it is today. Now, here is the interesting thing about this food hierarchy. It was not absolute. It could be and often was disrupted, complicated, and renegotiated by an external force that none of the nobles, however powerful, could ignore: the church. Because for roughly 1/3 of every year, the same nobleman who had served gilded swan and saffron-spiced game at his high table was forbidden on pain of spiritual consequence from eating any of it. No meat, no eggs, no butter, no cream. And the elaborate, sometimes breathtaking, sometimes faintly absurd ways in which the medieval world navigated these restrictions is a story that is equal parts spiritual devotion, ingenious cookery, and spectacular theological creative accounting, including, as I promised you, a beaver who was very much a fish. Right then, the beaver. I promised you beaver, and I intend to deliver. But first let me give you the full scope of what we are actually talking about, because the beaver story only makes sense once you understand the scale of what the medieval church was asking of ordinary people, and what lengths both peasants and nobles went to in order to cope with it. Here's a number that still surprises me every time I think about it. Roughly 1/3 of the entire year in medieval Europe was classified by the Catholic Church as a day of fasting or abstinence from meat. 1/3. That is not a typo. Between Fridays, which were mandatory fast days in commemoration of the crucifixion, and Wednesdays or Saturdays in various periods and regions, and then the great fasting seasons of Lent and Advent, you are looking at somewhere between 130 and 150 days per year, when eating meat was in principle forbidden to every Christian in Western Europe. Not just some Christians, all of them, peasant or prince, farmer or king. Think about what that means in practice. For a medieval family already living on a diet with limited variety, already dependent on seasonal produce, already working their bodies hard from sunrise to sunset, losing access to the most calorie-dense, protein-rich food in their diet for more than 4 months out of every year was not an inconvenience. It was a genuine physical challenge, and it was backed up by the full moral and legal authority of the Church, which at this point in history was not just a spiritual institution, it was the backbone of every aspect of public life. The Lent fast was the most extreme, 40 days from Ash Wednesday to Easter, and in the stricter interpretation that prevailed for much of the medieval period, this did not just mean no meat. It meant no animal products at all, no eggs, no butter, no milk, no cheese. The Church called these things lacticenia white meats, and on the most devout reading of the rules they were off the table alongside pork and beef and poultry. On Ash Wednesday and Good Friday you were supposed to eat nothing at all. On the other days of Lent the one permitted meal was to be eaten no earlier than midday, and in the strictest tradition not until 3 in the afternoon, the hour associated with the death of Jesus. A 15th century English schoolboy whose diary has survived wrote with the exasperated candour of a teenager, "Thou wilt not believe how weary I am of fish, and how much I desire that flesh were come in again. For I have eaten none other than salt fish this Lent, and it has engendered so much phlegm within me that it stops my pipes that I can scarcely speak nor breathe." A child complaining about fish in a way that is so recognisable across 7 centuries that it almost makes me laugh out loud. Now here is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the question immediately arose, and it arose in every corner of Christian Europe, from the Arctic coasts of Scandinavia to the sun-baked valleys of Spain, of exactly what counted as meat and what did not. Fish was clearly permitted. The sea was the loophole. If it came from the water, it was fine. The theological reasoning, as later articulated by Thomas Aquinas in his landmark 13th century work, Summa Theologica, was that land animals were too pleasurable, too rich, too intimately connected with bodily desires, and what Aquinas politely called concupiscence. Fish being cold-blooded and aquatic and generally less delicious was considered spiritually safer. Aquinas, bless him, also argued that fish was fine because it was less likely to make you, I'm going to quote him here gently translated, lustful. This is the theological reasoning that changed the eating habits of hundreds of millions of people. Cold fish equals spiritual safety. Warm meat equals dangerous passions. It is extraordinary, and it is 100% historically documented. So fish was allowed. Great if you lived on the coast. But what if you lived in landlocked Central Europe? What if the nearest ocean was a week's journey away and the only fish available was salted cod that had been in a barrel for 2 months and tasted, as the aforesaid schoolboy noted, of phlegm and despair? People got creative. And here is where the logic of medieval animal classification becomes genuinely wonderfully strange. The working principle was this: if an animal lived in water, spent significant time in water, or was in some way associated with water, it might qualify as fish under ecclesiastical law. This was not official church doctrine from Rome. It was a combination of regional rulings, local bishops making pragmatic decisions for their congregations, scholars at universities interpreting scripture, with varying degrees of flexibility, and frankly, a lot of people just quietly doing what they needed to do and hoping no one looked too closely. The barnacle goose was a spectacular case. This is a real bird, a small handsome species that breeds in the Arctic and migrates south through Europe for the winter. Its migratory habits were so mysterious to medieval observers that a popular theory developed the barnacle goose did not hatch from eggs like other birds. Instead, it grew from barnacles clinging to driftwood and ocean rocks. The medieval writer Gerald of Wales, writing in the 12th century, described seeing the birds emerging from these barnacles hanging by their beaks from driftwood until they were ready to fly away. This was not considered fringe pseudoscience. Gerald was an educated, respected cleric. His account was cited by others, and the theological implication was clear. If the barnacle goose was born from the sea, rather than from eggs laid on land, then it was in some meaningful sense a creature of the water, which meant it might qualify as fish for fasting purposes. This was useful information for people living on the coasts of Ireland, Scotland and northern England, where barnacle geese were abundant and salted cod was much less so. Then there were puffins. The abbey in northern France that was found eating puffins during Lent argued with impressive commitment that puffins were found near and around water and were therefore fish. The local archbishop was sceptical. The abbey apparently was not particularly moved by his scepticism. And then there were the dolphins, a 15th century cookbook from an Austrian nunnery. A nunnery contains recipes for dolphin roasts and dolphin sausages, cheerfully described as ideal for fast days, because dolphins were after all from the sea. But the most famous case of all is the one I teased you with at the end of last time, the beaver. Here is the story in its full magnificent absurdity. In 1659, François de Laval, who would become the first Catholic Bishop of Quebec in Canada, faced a pastoral problem. His congregation, the settlers and trappers of New France, were killing enormous numbers of beavers for their fur, and naturally when you have killed a beaver for its pelt, you have a substantial amount of beaver meat on your hands, and Lent was coming. Bishop Laval wrote to the theologians at the Sorbonne University in Paris, which was then the most prestigious theological institution in Europe, and asked whether his flock could eat beaver meat on fast days. The Sorbonne theologians considered the question. They consulted, they deliberated, and they wrote back with their ruling. The beaver, due to its semi-aquatic lifestyle and crucially its scaly tail, which apparently resembled the tail of a fish, could be classified as a fish for dietary purposes during Lent. The beaver was fish. Problem solved. Eat the beaver. A 1760 publication reporting on this decision described it with wonderful deadpan authority in respect to the beaver's tail. It stated the animal is a perfect fish and has been judicially declared such by the College of Physicians at Paris, and the Faculty of Divinity have in consequence of this declaration pronounced it lawful to be eaten on days of fasting. Now I want to be fair to history here and note that this was almost certainly a regional theological ruling, not a binding edict from the Vatican. Most historians who have studied this case carefully, including those who have gone looking for a direct papal decree, have not found one. What they have found instead is a pattern local bishops and regional theologians across Catholic Europe and the Americas routinely made these kinds of pragmatic accommodations for their communities, classifying semi-aquatic animals as fish equivalents based on their relationship to water. The capybara, the world's largest rodent native to South America, received a similar dispensation for Catholics in Venezuela after a clergyman wrote asking whether it could be consumed during Lent. It could swim. It spent time in water. Fish. A 2005 newspaper article about this tradition quoted a Venezuelan restaurant owner saying without any apparent irony, "I know it's a rat, but it tastes really good." The alligator in certain parts of Louisiana and the American South has been classified as permissible on Fridays for similar aquatic reasons, a tradition that continues in some communities to this day. What I love about all of this genuinely love is what it reveals about the relationship between religious authority and human hunger. The church had enormous power over how people ate. It dictated the rhythm of the year, the content of meals, the physical experience of hunger and satiation for hundreds of millions of people across more than 1,000 years. And people complied most of the time with remarkable earnestness. But they also pushed back, not with rebellion, with ingenuity. Because at the same time that bishops were classifying beavers as fish in the New World, the noble kitchens of Europe were engaged in a completely parallel exercise in creative theological evasion. And the results were some of the most extraordinary food in human history. When dairy and eggs were forbidden during Lent, the wealthy did not simply eat less. They invented substitutes, and the most important of these was almond milk. You think almond milk is a modern invention? It has been around for at least 800 years. In medieval European kitchens, particularly during fasting periods, almonds were ground and mixed with water to produce a rich, creamy liquid that could replace dairy in almost any recipe. It could thicken sauces. It could be poured over fish. It could be set into a jelly. And this is where the ingenuity becomes almost unsettling. It could be used to create what medieval cooks called illusion food. A recipe from a manuscript dated to around 1430, now held in the British Library, gives instructions for making what it calls Iraun in Lentin, eggs in Lent. The method is as follows: take a real egg, carefully make a small hole at each end, blow out the raw contents entirely, wash the shell, then fill it with almond milk jelly half-coloured yellow with saffron to mimic the yolk, half left pale to mimic the white, and seal it, chill it, serve it. The result was an egg that looked exactly like a hard-boiled egg on the outside. But when you cracked it open, it contained jelly made from ground almonds set inside a real eggshell with a fake saffron yolk floating in the centre. One modern food historian who attempted to recreate this recipe described it as looking like an egg's zombie counterpart, with a pallid jelly that was texturally somewhere between baby food and aspic, and tasted, she noted delicately, nothing at all like an egg, but it was technically permitted. Medieval cooks also created fake ham out of pink salmon and fish roes striped together to mimic the layers of fat and flesh in a cut of pork. They moulded fish paste into the shapes of roasted venison joints. They made fake butter from almonds. They stuffed cleaned pig bladders not with meat but with fish and almond paste to create the appearance of familiar sausages. Entire banquets were constructed around the fiction that the guests were eating what they were not. The illusion was the point. The skill of the cook was demonstrated by how convincingly the prohibited could be mimicked, using only what was permitted, and I find this genuinely moving for reasons that surprised me when I first sat with it. Because here were two groups of people, the wealthy noble with his staff of almond milk engineers, and the peasant sitting by the fire with salted herring and a silent prayer for Easter, both navigating the same constraints, both working within the same system of rules, both finding ways to preserve something that mattered to them, the pleasure of food, the dignity of a good meal, the small daily joy of eating something that tasted like more than deprivation. The peasant could not make fake eggs from almond milk. That required time, money, and skill that most people did not have. But the peasant had the beaver, or the barnacle goose, or the herbs from the garden that made even salted cod smell like a Tuesday rather than a punishment. And the whole elaborate, sometimes absurd structure of fasting and feasting reveals something profound about how food worked in the medieval world that we tend to forget. It was never just about nutrition. It was about meaning, about time, about community marked by what you ate together and what you gave up together. The feast after Lent tasted better because of the fast before it. Easter was joyful partly because the 6 weeks preceding it had been genuinely difficult. There is a word still used in some Catholic traditions that comes directly from this period, carnival, from the Latin can levar, literally, the farewell to meat. The wild celebrations of the days before Ash Wednesday, Mardi Gras, Shrove Tuesday, Fat Tuesday were the final feast before the long abstinence. You ate everything you had, you drank, you danced, you celebrated with the full knowledge that tomorrow the plates would be cleared and the pot would be scrubbed out and the long, quiet fish-scented weeks of Lent would begin. The party was made beautiful by what came after it, and the discipline of Lent was made bearable by what came after that. That rhythm of abundance and restraint of feast and fast of communal celebration, followed by communal sacrifice, shaped the entire social calendar of medieval Europe for 1,000 years. It told people when they were in time. It gave structure to the year. It bound communities together in shared hunger and shared relief. And funnily enough, every modern nutritionist, psychologist, and longevity researcher who has studied patterns of eating and well-being has noted something not entirely different, that the alternation of abundance and restraint of indulgence and discipline, of communal feasting and mindful restriction, is actually good for you. The medieval church knew this. They just had different reasons for recommending it. So we have moved now through the shared spaces where people slept and lived, through the fires they kept burning, and the food they cooked together, through the great forced fasts that shaped their calendar, and the extraordinary ingenuity those fasts inspired. But there is someone in all of this, someone who appears in nearly every story we have told so far, who has been operating mostly at the edge of the frame. She was the one who managed the food stores, who held the keys literally, who brewed the ale that kept the family alive through winter, who knew which herbs cured a fever and which ones flavoured a stew, who kept the household economy running, while the historical record mostly looked the other way. The medieval woman at the centre of domestic life deserves her own story, and it is far more powerful than most people expect. Picture this for a moment. It's a warm Tuesday morning in England, somewhere around the year 1300. In a potter's workshop on the edge of a village, archaeologists centuries later will find something extraordinary pressed into the clay, tiny fingerprints. Children's fingerprints, small and unmistakable, embedded in the walls of pots that were made and used and eventually buried. The children who left them were not making pottery. They were just there, close to their parents in the workshop handling the clay, learning by touching, being part of it without quite being old enough to do it properly yet. Those fingerprints are my favourite piece of evidence from the entire history of medieval childhood. They do not appear in any document. They were not recorded by any scribe. They are just the accidental residue of small hands that wanted to be near the work, near the adults, near the centre of things. And they tell us something that centuries of scholarly debate often obscures. Medieval children were deeply, genuinely present in the lives of their families, not at the margins, not tucked away in separate spaces waiting to become useful, right there, in the clay. The popular image of medieval childhood, and I want to address this head-on because it is genuinely widespread, is that children in the Middle Ages were treated as little adults. That medieval people had no concept of childhood as a protected, innocent phase of life. That they put their children to work as soon as they could walk, and expected them to simply be miniature versions of whatever their parents were. This idea comes primarily from a single enormously influential book published in 1960 by a French historian named Philippe Ariès. His argument, based largely on the fact that medieval paintings rarely depicted children with distinctly childlike features, was that medieval society had no sense of childhood as a separate category of human experience. Historians have been unpicking this argument carefully and politely ever since. The modern scholarly consensus is considerably more nuanced and considerably more interesting. What we actually know from coroners' records, from wills and inventories, from miracle stories, from the beautiful and surprising material record of toys found in the mud of medieval rivers, is that medieval children were loved, played with, worried, overeducated according to their station, and understood to be in a distinct phase of life with its own characteristics and needs. The formal medieval understanding was this life had stages. Infancy from birth to age 7 was a time of growth. Childhood from 7 to 14 was a time of play. Adolescence began at puberty around 12 for girls, 14 for boys, and was when the real business of preparing for adult life intensified. That framework, borrowed partly from Roman law and partly from classical philosophy, was genuinely believed and genuinely practiced. And it matters because it tells us that the medieval world understood something we sometimes forget, that children are not just incomplete adults. They are people in a particular phase of being with particular needs. Now, does this mean medieval childhood was easy or free from hardship? No. Absolutely not. Infant mortality in medieval Europe was devastating. Modern demographic estimates suggest that roughly 25% of children died in their first year of life. Another 12% or so between ages 1 and 4, another 6% between 5 and 9. By the time a child reached adolescence, there was perhaps a 50-50 chance they had already lost at least one sibling. Death was present in medieval childhood in a way that most of us in the modern developed world cannot fully imagine. not as a distant abstraction, but as a recurring feature of family life, something that visited the household and sometimes took the baby from the cradle or the toddler from beside the fire. And the fire was in fact one of the most common sources of childhood accidents. Coroner's records from medieval England and England has an unusually rich archive of these records going back to the 12th and 13th centuries, paint a vivid picture of the hazards of childhood in small fire-lit one-room homes. More than 1/3 of the children recorded in these inquests died from fires. Cradles placed too close to the hearth. Swaddled infants who could not roll away from falling sparks. Toddlers left alone for a moment while a mother stepped outside to tend to animals or fetch water. One record describes a mother leaving her 4-month-old daughter in the care of an older sibling, a sibling who was perhaps 6 years old while she went out to shear a sheep. On her return, the baby was dead, tangled in the bands of her cradle. The older child had not been negligent in any deliberate way. They were simply a 6-year-old given a responsibility that no 6-year-old could reliably manage. This is heartbreaking to read, and it is also revealing, because that 6-year-old babysitter is not a symbol of a childhood without protection. It is a symbol of a world where resources were thin, where adults had to work to survive, and where children were woven into the fabric of daily life, in ways that were sometimes beautiful, those fingerprints in the clay, and sometimes genuinely dangerous. Let me ask you something. Think about your own childhood, or the childhood of someone you know and love. At what age did you first feel genuinely useful, not just tolerated, but needed? At what age did someone trust you with something real? For medieval children, that threshold came earlier. Not because their parents cared less, the historical evidence is clear that they cared deeply, but because the margin of survival was thinner, and the community was structured in a way that expected every us to contribute according to their capacity. By age 7, most peasant children were doing something. Herding geese or chickens, a task requiring only basic competence and willingness to stay out of trouble. Gathering wood or berries, carrying messages between adults, watching younger siblings. The Bedfordshire coroner's rolls from 13th and 14th century England include a record of a 10-year-old boy working in a manor kitchen, chopping vegetables, who dropped his knife and stabbed his foot. He was in the kitchen, working, at 10. But here is what that same record also shows us: he was in the kitchen with adults. He was not labouring alone in some distant field. He was present in the household, learning by proximity, which is exactly how human beings learned skills for most of our species' existence. And when children were not working, when the afternoon light was long and the chores were done, they played. They played with an enthusiasm and ingenuity that has left traces in the archaeological record that genuinely delight me every time I encounter them. The Thames in London has given up an extraordinary collection of medieval children's artefacts pulled from the mud banks by archaeology and by centuries of tidal movement. Among them, a tiny knight in armour cast from a metal mould produced in large numbers and sold at markets, probably around the year 1300. Little cups and plates and jugs, some sturdy enough to be heated by a fireside. So these were not just decorative miniatures but functional tiny kitchens, belonging to girls who played at cooking with real heat. Toy boats, bone skates for winter ice, wooden swords. The fact that someone made these things that adults invested time and craft and money and objects, whose only purpose was to delight a child, is its own form of evidence about how medieval parents felt about their children. Gerald of Wales, the 12th century cleric who also gave us the barnacle goose theory from last time, wrote that as a child he used to build in the sand on the beach with his brothers. While his brothers built sand castles, Gerald built sand monasteries, which is perhaps the most perfectly on-brand detail in all of medieval history. Children played ball games, games with sticks and stones, wrestling, running races. They played chess and backgammon when the materials were available, carved game boards from the cloisters of Canterbury Cathedral, show 9 men's Morris grids scratched directly into the stone by children who apparently found their lessons less compelling than a quiet game on the bench. They sang rhymes and riddles and passed along oral traditions of verses that were already ancient when they learned them. The historian Barbara Hannah Walt, who spent years studying childhood in medieval London, found that children were not isolated from adult life. They could not be in a world without separate spaces, without yards and bedrooms and schools, as we understand them, but that adults genuinely tried to create space for play within the texture of daily life. Children were expected to help. They were also expected to be children. Now, at around age 12 for girls and 14 for boys, the transition toward adult responsibilities sharpened significantly. For boys from wealthy or merchant families, this often meant apprenticeship. A formal contractual arrangement signed by parents supervised by a guild, lasting anywhere from 3 to 10 years, in which the boy left his family home and entered the household of a master craftsman who would teach him a trade in exchange for his labour. The apprentice received food, clothing and shelter. The contract specified not just the trade to be learned, but the master's obligations to the boy, to teach without holding back, to discipline appropriately and not cruelly, to treat the apprentice as a member of the household. This is a detail that tends to get lost in discussions of medieval childhood apprenticeship. Was not just economic. It was a form of family extension. The master took on something of the role of a parent. The apprentice was integrated into a new household, eating at the same table, sleeping under the same roof, learning not just a craft, but how to conduct himself in the world. For peasant children, the transition was less formal, but no less real. They simply took on larger shares of adult agricultural work gradually, until by their mid-teens they were doing the full labour of adults. Girls learned to manage a household with genuine complexity, not just cooking but preserving food for winter brewing ale, tending animals, managing the finances of a family economy where the margin between enough and not enough was frighteningly thin. This is something I want to dwell on for a moment because I think it contains something genuinely worth recovering. Medieval children learned by being present, not by being taught in classrooms, not by being separated from adult life until they were ready for it, but by watching and helping and gradually being trusted with more. The pottery fingerprints. The girl helping her mother cook at an age when we would now call her a toddler. The boy in the kitchen at 10. The apprentice watching the master's hands at 14, memorizing the angle of the tool against the wood. This is how human beings learned skills for almost all of our history. And there is something in it, something about the texture of intergenerational knowledge about the intimacy of learning, by proximity about the dignity of being trusted with real work at an early age that our modern systems of childhood and education have largely dismantled, and that some parents and educators are now quietly trying to find their way back to. I do not want to romanticize medieval childhood. The infant mortality was real. The hazards were real. The exhaustion and poverty and grief were real. I am not suggesting we return to a world where a 6-year-old is responsible for a 4-month-old sibling and the consequences of an accident are fatal. But I do think there is something worth examining in the mirror those fingerprints in the clay hold up to us. A child who was present, who was needed, who was part of the work and the warmth and the difficulty of the household, not because no one cared whether they were protected, but because protection and participation were not considered opposites. Because being loved in that world included being trusted, being included, being considered capable of something real. Those prints in the pottery are 800 years old. The child who made them is long gone, but the impulse, the small hand reaching out to touch what the adults are doing, wanting to be part of it, wanting to matter, is as alive as anything I know. We have talked about children, about the way they played and worked and learned by being woven into adult life. But there is one more layer to this story. One more way that the shared daily life of medieval families shaped not just how people lived, but how entire villages and communities understood themselves as something larger than a collection of individual households. Because the medieval world had a word for all the land and resources that belonged to everyone and no one to the whole community, rather than any single person. They called it the commons, and what happened to the commons and why it was taken away is one of the most consequential stories in the entire history of how families share space, food and daily life. Somewhere in the English Midlands, in a county called Northamptonshire, there is a village that has been there since before the Norman conquest. Its name is Laxton. And unlike every other surviving English village, Laxton still farms its land the way English villages farmed for roughly 1,000 years before the modern world arrived to reorganize everything. The fields around Laxton are still open, still divided into long, thin strips, still farmed by individual families working narrow plots that are scattered across different fields, so that no single family gets all the good land or all the bad. The village still holds a manorial court once a year, one of the last functioning examples in England, where the community gathers to settle disputes about field boundaries, manage the rotation of crops, and collectively decide how the shared land will be worked in the year ahead. Laxton survived because a sequence of historical accidents kept the enclosure movement at bay. It is in that sense a living relic, a village caught in amber, and when I read about it I feel something I cannot quite name, a kind of recognition of something older and more communal than anything most of us have experienced in our own lives. Because what Laxton preserved and what nearly every other English village lost over the course of about 400 years was not just a way of farming, it was a way of living, a whole social ecology of shared resources, mutual obligation, and collective survival that had shaped the daily life of ordinary families for longer than anyone fully knows. Let me build this picture carefully because it is genuinely beautiful and also genuinely complicated, In a medieval English village, the land around the settlement was divided into roughly 2 or 3 large open fields. Each of these fields was enormous, sometimes several hundred acres, and they were subdivided into hundreds of long, thin strips. Each farming family held a collection of strips scattered across the fields, not all in one place, deliberately scattered. This seems inefficient to a modern eye. Why not give each family one compact farm, easy to manage, easy to walk around? The answer, and it is a very good answer, is risk management. If your strips are scattered, you have some on the heavy clay at the bottom of the valley and some on the lighter loam on the hillside. You have some in the sheltered spot and some on the exposed edge. If a frost kills the low ground or a drought kills the high ground, you are not wiped out. Your neighbour, whose strips are interspersed with yours, is also not wiped out. You have collectively spread the risk. This was not accidental. It was a community decision enforced and maintained by a manorial court that met regularly and made binding rulings about how the fields would be managed, when to plough, when to harvest, which field to leave fallow this year to recover its fertility. These were not individual choices, they were collective ones. The entire village operated on a coordinated agricultural calendar, and everyone's participation in it was both a right and a responsibility. But the strips in the fields were only part of the picture, because beyond the cultivated land there was the commons itself. The commons, the pasture, the woodland, the fen, the heath. The meadow was shared land that belonged in a meaningful sense to everyone in the village with the right to use it. These rights were specific, carefully defined and vigorously defended. The right of pasture to graze your animals on the common fields. The right of estovers to collect firewood from fallen branches and small trees. The right of turbary to cut peat or turf for fuel. The right of pannage to let your pigs roam the woodland in autumn to eat fallen acorns and beech nuts, fattening themselves for winter on what would otherwise go to waste. And then there was gleaning. After the harvest, when the reapers had moved through the fields and the sheaves had been carried away, the women and children of the village would walk the stubbled ground and collect the grain that had been left behind. The single heads of wheat that had fallen off the stalks, the loose kernels scattered by the harvesters. It was not much, but for a family at the edge of subsistence. A few extra pounds of grain gathered in the weeks after harvest could make the difference between a tight winter and a genuinely desperate one. Gleaning was not exactly a legal right. It was something between a right and a custom, something so deeply embedded in village life that everyone understood it to be legitimate even if no document formally encoded it. And it had a biblical warrant behind it. The Book of Ruth in the Hebrew Scriptures describes the poor being permitted to glean the fields of the wealthy. The practice was ancient. It was in its small way a recognition that the harvest was not entirely the property of whoever had sown the seed. Some of it belonged to whoever needed it most. This whole system, the strips, the commons, the rotations, the gleaning, was not a utopia. I want to be clear about that. It was hierarchical. The lord of the manor sat at the top with his own domain land and his own rights that superseded those of the commoners. There were significant differences in how much land different families held. There were disputes, grievances, unfairnesses embedded in every layer of the structure. Medieval village life was not some pastoral dream of perfect equality, but within its limits it provided something genuinely remarkable, a shared safety net woven from collective resources. Even the poorest family in the village, those who held only a small cottage and a tiny strip of garden, had access to the commons. They could graze a few geese, they could gather firewood, they could glean after harvest. They were not wealthy, but they were not entirely at the mercy of the market either. They had a connection to the land and its resources that did not depend on anyone's permission from one day to the next. Here is the number that gives me pause every time I sit with it. Historians who have studied the economics of common land systems have found that in areas where cottagers were allowed to keep a cow on the commons, just one cow per family, those families almost never needed to apply for poor relief. Their access to milk, butter and cheese from that single animal was enough to provide the nutritional and economic margin that kept them out of destitution. One cow, grazed on land that belonged to everyone, enough to keep a family above the threshold. Now I want to ask you something genuinely, and I find this question harder the more I sit with it. When was the last time you had access to something that was genuinely shared, not borrowed, not rented, not purchased, shared? A resource that was simply there, maintained collectively available to everyone who needed it, regulated by community agreement rather than individual ownership. Because most of us, if we are honest, do not have this. And the reason we do not have it traces directly back to a process that began in the 15th century and accelerated dramatically in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the enclosure movement. The wool trade in Tudor England created an economic incentive that changed everything. Sheep were enormously profitable. Wool was in high demand across Europe, and grazing sheep required much less labour than growing grain. A landlord who could convert his common fields to sheep pasture could make considerably more money with considerably fewer workers. The obstacle was the commons with all its customary rights, its grazing limits, its gleaning traditions, its interlocking web of obligations and entitlements. The commons was in the way. Enclosure was the process of removing it, of consolidating the scattered strips into compact farms, of fencing off the pasture and the woodland, of converting land that had been managed collectively for centuries into land that was owned by one person and used however that person decided. The historian E.P. Thompson, one of the greatest historians of the English working class, a man who spent his life making sure that ordinary people's experiences did not disappear from the historical record, described enclosure in terms that have never left me. He called it directly a plain enough case of class robbery played according to fair rules of property and law laid down by a parliament of property owners. The rules, in other words, were made by the people who benefited from them. The commoners who lost their rights were not represented in the parliament that passed the acts that stripped those rights away. In Tudor England, the initial wave of enclosures was slow and individual, a landlord here, a series of private agreements there. And there was genuine pushback. The monarchs of the period were alarmed. They worried practically that dispossessed peasants would become vagabonds and criminals. Henry VII's Parliament passed acts against enclosure. Commissioners were appointed to investigate. The Crown was not in this period entirely on the side of the enclosers. but the logic of profit was too powerful to contain indefinitely. Between 1750 and 1850, approximately 4,000 Acts of Parliament were passed converting common land into private property. 4,000 individual pieces of legislation, each one stripping a specific community of rights it had held for centuries, sometimes for as long as living memory stretched or written record reached. By the end of that century, the rural England that had existed since the Anglo-Saxon settlements was effectively gone. In 1542, Henry VIII gave his friend Sir William Herbert a dissolved monastery and the lands around it. Herbert tore down the buildings, expelled the tenants, and turned the land into a private hunting park. The people who had grazed animals on that land for generations tore down his fences. His agents arrested them. They rebuilt the fences. Others tore them down again. This pattern, enclosure resistance, brutal suppression, resumed enclosure repeated itself across England for 3 centuries. In the English fens, the great drainage projects of the 1620s to 1700s aimed to convert the vast wetlands of Lincolnshire and surrounding counties into farmable land. For the thousands of families who lived in those fens, fishing, fowling, cutting reeds, living off a wet landscape that outsiders saw as waste, but that sustained entire communities, the drainage was existential. They resisted for generations. There were riots. There were constables who refused to serve warrants. There were leaders who became local heroes whose names were passed down in families long after the fens were gone. And then there were the Highland clearances of Scotland, which began in the 18th century and continued into the 19th. The landlords of the Scottish Highlands, many of them aristocrats who had recently acquired their estates through a series of legal and political changes, decided that sheep farming was more profitable than the communities of crofters who had lived on their lands for generations. The solution was simple and terrible: clear the people out. Contemporary accounts from the Sutherland clearances, among the most documented and most horrifying, describe agents of the Duchess of Sutherland arriving at remote townships with no warning, pulling down the houses of people who had lived there for as long as anyone could remember, and immediately setting fire to the wreckage so the families could not shelter in the ruins. People were loaded onto ships heading to Canada and Australia. Those who resisted were arrested. Those who stayed tried to survive in coastal areas utterly unsuited to feeding them. The Highlands of Scotland today are among the most thinly populated landscapes in Europe. A land that once held tens of thousands of people now holds almost no one. The wildlife is there. The dramatic scenery beloved by tourists is there. The people are gone. And here is the thing I want you to sit with for a moment, because I think it is the most important observation in this entire part of our story. The medieval commons was not simply about land or food or economic survival, as vital as all of those things were. It was about identity, about a sense of belonging to a place and a community in a way that was material and daily and irreversible. Historian Ellen Rosenman, who has studied the political consequences of the enclosure movement, wrote that villagers had an identity rooted in a specific area and embedded in a web of familial and neighbourly relations that had defined that place through generations. When that web was cut, when the field was fenced, when the rights were extinguished, when the family left for the city or the colony, something that could not be rebuilt on purely economic terms was destroyed. The historian Jeanette Neeson, whose 1993 book Commoners did more than almost any other work to restore the story of common rights to public understanding, argued that the loss of common rights was not, as economists sometimes claimed, simply the loss of a small economic supplement to wages. It was the loss of an entire way of life organized around collective management of shared resources. The commoner who could graze her goose on the green, gather her wood from the copse, glean her grain from the stubble, she was not wealthy, but she was economically autonomous in a way that the landless labourer dependent on a weekly wage was not. This distinction between autonomy and dependence is the hinge on which the whole story turns. Before enclosure, a family's survival was connected to a web of shared resources, maintained collectively accessible without anyone's permission. After enclosure, survival depended on wages paid by someone else, in exchange for labour performed on land you did not own, buying food in a market you did not control. One system made people poor but independent. The other made some people spectacularly wealthy, and many others dependent on the goodwill and economic decisions of those who owned the land. I am not a romantic about the medieval commons. It had its own hierarchies, its own injustices, its own cruelties. The serfs who were tied to the land were not free people in any full sense. The system worked better for some families than for others, but there is something in the architecture of it, in the way it was organized around shared survival, rather than individual accumulation, in the way the village was genuinely a community of mutual dependence, rather than just a collection of people living near each other, that I find genuinely instructive when I look at the world we inhabit now. We are wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy by any historical measure, and yet loneliness is one of the defining public health crises of our time. And many people feel in a way they struggle to articulate that they are living side by side with their neighbours, without knowing them, consuming resources without managing them, participating in an economy without truly belonging to a community. The commons is gone, the gleaning is gone. The manorial court that once gathered every year to decide collectively how the land would be worked is gone. But maybe the impulse that made those things valuable, the impulse toward shared management, toward communal belonging, toward a safety net woven from collective resources rather than individual charity, maybe that is not gone. Maybe it is just waiting for a new form. So we have now moved through almost everything. The shared rooms, the communal beds, the central fire, the food that sustained everyone from season to season, the fasting and feasting that shaped the calendar, the women who ran the household economy, the children with their fingers in the clay, the commons that once belonged to everyone. What we have not talked about yet is how all of this ended. Not the commons that was the politics, but the idea of the communal house, the shared bedroom, the family gathered in a single room around a single fire, the invention of privacy. When it happened, who decided it was necessary, and what we have been doing with it ever since. All right, let's talk about the moment everything changed. Not all at once, history rarely works that way. But there was a hinge point, a period of roughly a century, when the world that had organized domestic life around shared space, shared fire, and shared sleep gave way to something entirely new. And the person who did more than anyone to articulate what that new world should look like, who helped give it its language, its moral framework, its emotional justification, was not a politician, not an architect, not even a philosopher. It was a sociologist writing in a German hotel room in 1939 on the eve of the worst war in history, with the world falling apart outside his window. His name was Norbert Elias, and his book, which he had barely finished before being forced to flee his homeland, and which went almost entirely unread for 30 years, is called The Civilizing Process. Elias spent years doing something that sounds almost impossibly dull, reading old books of etiquette, manners manuals from the medieval period, instructions for how to eat, how to sit, how to use a napkin, how to blow your nose. He read hundreds of them spanning from roughly the 13th century to the 19th. And what he noticed across all those centuries of instruction in proper behaviour was a pattern. The boundaries were moving. In the 13th century, the things you were instructed not to do in front of other people were extremely limited. Don't blow your nose onto the tablecloth. Don't pick meat from the communal dish with both hands at once. Don't wipe your knife on your bread before cutting. The rules assumed that you were sharing, space-sharing, food-sharing life with everyone around you. The instruction was just about maintaining basic function within that communal setting. By the 16th century, the manuals were more elaborate. Now you should not let others see you undress. Now you should not come to the table unwashed. Now you should not perform certain bodily functions in plain view of company. The instructions were starting to map out territories, things that should happen behind closed doors, things that should be hidden from the gaze of others. By the 19th century, this logic had been extended so far that an entire world of private rooms, private functions, private spaces had crystallized into what we now simply call normal life. Elias's argument, which is brilliant and genuinely unsettling, is that what we call civilization is largely this process. The gradual internalization of external constraints, the way that things which were once simply regulated by social rules became regulated by shame, and the way that shame required physical architecture to enforce itself. Closed doors, separate rooms, private spaces. In 1530, the humanist scholar Erasmus, the same Erasmus who helped define Renaissance thinking across Europe, wrote a widely read treatise on manners. And in that treatise he mentioned in a tone of perfectly medieval practicality that if you happened to be in a position where you needed to pass gas, you should not hold it in, as that was bad for your health. If you could do it quietly, that was preferable, but if not, well, better out than in. And if you happened to cough at the same moment, said Erasmus, that would be helpful cover for the sound. This is not Erasmus being scandalous. This is Erasmus being utterly normal for his period. The body was present, its functions were acknowledged. The goal was management, not concealment. By 1875, the British magazine Architect published an essay which I want to read you a version of because it captures the Victorian transformation perfectly, declaring that a bedroom used for any purpose other than sleeping was unwholesome and immoral. Unwholesome, immoral, not just inconvenient, not just untidy, morally wrong. This is the distance between 1530 and 1875, 3.5 centuries in which the body went from something present and managed to something hidden and shameful, in which sleeping together went from a simple fact of life to an indication of moral failure. in which the room where you rested your body became a symbol of your inner character. The Victorians did not invent privacy, but they industrialized it. They made it the organizing principle of the respectable home, and they did it in a context that gave them the resources to enforce that principle architecturally for the first time in history. The Industrial Revolution has done something unprecedented. It had, in the space of a few generations, created a new middle-class people, with incomes above pure subsistence below genuine wealth, and with enormous amounts of anxiety about which side of that line they were on. These families built houses, lots of houses, houses with corridors, the corridor being remarkably a Victorian innovation, so that you did not have to walk through one person's bedroom to reach another. Houses with specific rooms for specific purposes, a dining room for dining, a parlour for receiving guests, a kitchen hidden at the back where the servants worked, and crucially separate bedrooms for each member of the family. By the 1880s, the historian who has studied Victorian domestic life notes, it had become common for every member of a middle-class family to have their own bedroom, or at least their own corner of a shared one. Not a pallet on the floor of the great hall, not a place in the family bed, their own room, their own door, their own space. And here is what I find genuinely remarkable about this shift. It was framed explicitly and repeatedly not as luxury but as morality. Having a private bedroom was not simply comfortable, it was civilized. It was respectable. It was the mark of a family that had properly ordered its inner life. The families in the tenements of Manchester or the back streets of New York who still slept four to a room not from choice but from poverty were presented in the rhetoric of the period as morally compromised by their circumstances. Communal sleeping, which had been simply how humans lived for all of recorded history, was reframed as a sign of barbarism, a thing that primitive people did, a thing that the poor could not avoid but the decent aspired to escape. The sociologist Benjamin Rice, who wrote a history of sleep called Wild Nights, makes a point about this that has stayed with me. He argues that in the 18th and 19th centuries, ideas about civilized sleeping arrangements were a way for wealthy white Europeans and Americans to distinguish themselves from those they considered lesser. Images of enslaved Africans sleeping in the holds of ships, or of indigenous people on communal sleeping mats, were used as cautionary pictures of what civilization had transcended. Privacy was not just a comfort. It was a racial and class marker. I find this genuinely troubling, and I think it is worth sitting with the fact that the invention of privacy, which we now experience as a natural and obvious human need, was in part constructed through the lens of who was considered fully human and who was not. But let us also trace the positive side of this story, because the private bedroom was not only about class performance, it was also about something real. Think about what had been missing from domestic life for centuries: the ability to have a thought in silence, the ability to cry without being observed, the ability, as the historian A. Roger E. Kirch noted, for a wife to express concerns at night in the dark that she could not have voiced in the presence of the household during daylight. The private room gave people something they genuinely needed: a place to be alone, a space where the self could exist without being performed for an audience. And let's not pretend this was nothing. Privacy has real gifts. We have talked tonight about all the intimacy and warmth and connection of the communal medieval world. But there was also noise and lack of rest and the inability to ever be simply quiet with your own thoughts. The private room gave people that, and for many people, particularly women who had almost no other domain they could call the bedroom, became a genuine refuge. By the late 19th century, the writer and interior decorator Jane Ellen Panton was publishing advice for Victorian housewives about how to decorate their bedrooms. She recommended above all else a long chair. In the bedroom, a chaise longue, a reclining seat where a wife could rest when overwhelmed by the demands of household management and social performance, where she could be for a moment simply herself. That long chair is touching to me. It is the Victorian version of a door you can close. So where does all of this leave us? We are sitting right now, you listening, and me telling this story at the far end of a very long trajectory that began in single rooms full of smoke and shared warmth, and ended in apartments where nearly 1 in 3 Americans lives entirely alone. In 1960, single-person households accounted for roughly 13% of all households in the United States. By 2022, that number had more than doubled to 29%. In some European cities, the proportion is now above 40%. In Sweden and Finland, over 40% of all households are single-person households. This is, as the sociologist Eric Klinenberg has noted, the biggest demographic change of the last century that most people have failed to fully reckon with. For the first time in the history of our species which evolved living in groups which built its intelligence around social cooperation, which is wired at the biological level for regular contact with other humans, we have created a society where living in complete solitude is the standard arrangement for a substantial portion of the population, and yet the data on loneliness is genuinely complicated. Self-reported loneliness has not in fact been consistently rising in recent decades in most countries. Living alone is not the same as feeling lonely. Many of the people living alone in those Swedish apartments are choosing it, and they have rich social lives, strong friendships, regular community contact. So perhaps the question is not whether privacy was a mistake. Perhaps the question is more subtle than that. Let me put it this way. We began this story in a room full of smoke where a family of 7 shared a pile of straw and the warmth of a fire that never quite went out. There was no privacy. There was no silence. There was no door to close. There was only the shared breath of people whose survival was knotted together so tightly that to be alone was to be in danger. We ended in a room with white walls and a closing door and a name on the lease and the deep, genuine luxury of being able to think in silence. Both things are real. The warmth of the first room was real. The freedom of the second room is real. But here is what I keep coming back to, lying awake in my own quiet bedroom in my own quiet house. The families in those smoky medieval rooms did not choose their togetherness any more than we choose our separateness. They were placed in it by the limits of their world, just as we are placed in ours by the logic of ours. And in both cases something important is both gained and lost. What the medieval world had, and we mostly do not, is not merely warmth and proximity. It is the daily inescapable reminder that other people exist, that your survival is connected to theirs, that the fire needs tending not just for you, but for everyone sleeping around it. The private bedroom gave us freedom. but it also gave us permission to forget the people outside the door. And maybe that is what this entire long evening has been circling around all this time. Not a romantic argument that we should go back to sleeping in one room with our pigs, not a claim that the medieval world was better, but a question, a sincere, uncomfortable, genuinely important question about what we were in such a hurry to leave behind. Because having watched privacy arrive and having understood what it cost and what it gave us, there is one more chapter to this story, the strangest one of all. What happened when the Victorian privacy ideal, so hard won, so recently built, began to crack again in the 20th and 21st centuries, when the walls that had been constructed to give the self its own room started to dissolve in new ways we never anticipated, because the story of shared space food and daily life did not end with the private bedroom. It just moved somewhere else entirely. Something happened in the American suburb in the 1950s that the world had never seen before. Actually, that is not quite right. Many things had happened in many places before, but they had never all happened at exactly the same time, to exactly the same scale, with exactly the same force. A perfect storm of economics ideology, fear government policy and consumer culture converged for roughly 15 years from about 1950 to 1965 and produced a way of living that would be sold to the world as the natural condition of the civilized human being. The two-parent nuclear family, the detached suburban house, the lawn, the car, the television. We know the image. We have all grown up with it, even those of us who were born long after it had already begun to crack. 2 parents, 2.5 children, a dog of some kind, a house separated from every other house by carefully maintained distance. Father leaves in the morning. Mother manages the interior world. Children attend school, come home, watch television, eat dinner at a table in the kitchen. It looked from the outside like the end point of history. Like everything that had come before the shared rooms, the communal fires, the villages organized around common resources had been leading up to this. The private family in its private house finally free from the entanglements of everyone else. But here is the thing about that image. It was only true for about 15 years, and it was never true for everyone. Between 1950 and 1970, the American suburban population nearly doubled, reaching 74 million people. The growth was not organic, it was engineered. The federal government's GE bill and subsidized mortgage programs made home ownership accessible to millions of veterans and their families. New highway systems made the suburbs reachable from city centres. Zoning laws mandated single-family homes in enormous swaths of the landscape, not by accident, but as deliberate policy choices that also, not coincidentally, reinforced racial and economic segregation. The television told everyone what life was supposed to look like inside those houses. Leave it to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet. Father knows best. Week after week, the same structure, a benign father, a warm mother, mischievous but fundamentally wholesome children, minor domestic comedies resolved within 22 minutes. The conflicts were never real conflicts. The houses were never actually dirty. Nobody was ever genuinely alone. The historian David Brooks, writing in The Atlantic in 2020, described what happened during those 15 years as a freakish historical moment when all of society conspired wittingly and not to obscure the essential fragility of the nuclear family. He was right, and the fragility showed almost immediately. By the mid-1960s, divorce rates were climbing, fertility rates were dropping, and the women who had been assigned to manage those private domestic interiors were starting to say, very clearly, that something was wrong. Because here is what the suburban nuclear family actually meant for the women inside it. You took everything that had once been a community function, the raising of children, the management of food, the care of the elderly, the emotional labor of maintaining relationships, and you placed it entirely on two people. Specifically, you placed most of it on one of those two people. You stripped away the extended family, the neighbors who shared your backyard, the grandmother who lived down the street, the village network of women who had always helped each other through birth and sickness, and the relentless demands of daily life. And you told one woman in one house that this was now her domain, and she should be grateful for it. The sociologist Robert Bellah, writing the landmark 1985 book Habits of the Heart, captured the result with characteristic precision. American culture, he wrote, left individuals suspended in glorious but terrifying isolation. The freedom of the private house had curdled for many people into something that looked less like liberty and more like loneliness. And it was a particular kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of being unwanted or unloved, the loneliness of being completely surrounded by the demands of a small sealed unit with no larger community to draw on, no common land to walk out to, no village square to stand in for a moment and just be among other people going about their lives. I want to stop here and ask you something, because I think this is the part of our story that hits closest to home. Have you ever been in a house, a comfortable house, a warm house, a house you chose and still felt at the end of a long week as if something was missing? Not a person, not a thing, just a texture, a kind of social density that wasn't there. I think a lot of people who grew up in the post-war suburbs felt exactly this. They had everything the culture told them they should want, and it was still somehow not quite enough. Robert Putnam, the political scientist who studied this question more carefully than almost anyone, published a book in the year 2000 called Bowling Alone. The title came from a simple observation. Americans were bowling more than ever, but bowling leagues organize communal regular bowling with the same people. Week after week were in dramatic decline. People were doing the activity alone without the social structure around it. And Putnam traced this pattern across hundreds of domains of American civic life, church attendance, neighborhood associations, parent-teacher organizations, dinner party hosting, local club membership, all declining, all moving in the same direction toward a life of increasing private comfort and decreasing communal engagement. Something important, Putnam wrote, happened to social bonds and civic engagement in America over the last third of the 20th century. I will tell you what I think happened from where I sit inside this long history we have been moving through tonight. The Victorians invented the private bedroom and the suburb perfected it. They took privacy, which had genuine gifts which we should not dismiss, and extended it to its logical conclusion. They built a world organized entirely around the individual and the nuclear family unit. And in doing so, they dismantled slowly and without fully realizing it the web of informal communal support that had kept ordinary people functional through all of previous human history. The medieval peasant in her smoky room with the perpetual pot on the fire had something we lost when we built the suburb. Not the smoke, obviously, not the pig in the corner, but the neighbour whose child could help watch your baby while you sheared the sheep. The shared oven in the village where you waited with the other women and talked about what was happening. The common land where you grazed your cow alongside everyone else's cow, and where by the sheer physics of proximity, you knew the people around you. The suburb promised community, all those identical houses, all those families living the same life, but it delivered isolation. Because the houses were sealed, the cars moved everyone past each other without stopping. The televisions provided simulated community without requiring actual participation. You could live in a suburb for 10 years and never know your neighbour's last name. And then something extraordinary happened. People started looking for what they had lost. In Denmark in the late 1960s, a group of families and architects began experimenting with a new model they called bofællesskab, which translates roughly as living communities. The idea was elegantly simple private homes, each fully self-contained with their own kitchens and bedrooms and doors that could be locked, and lives that were completely private, arranged around a shared central building with a large kitchen, a dining room, a common space. Residents who wanted to could eat together a few nights a week. They shared tools, childcare, occasional labour. They were neighbours who had actually chosen to be neighbours, who had organised their physical space around the intention of knowing each other. The first such community in the world, called Sættedammen, was built just outside Copenhagen in 1972. It is still there. It is still functioning. More than 50 years later, the same community continues to share meals, make decisions together, and maintain the social infrastructure its founders built. This model, which came to be called co-housing when it crossed the Atlantic, spread slowly at first, then faster. The first co-housing community in the United States was built in Davis, California in 1991. Today there are hundreds of them across the country and thousands worldwide. They look different from each other, some urban, some rural, some enormous, some tiny, but they share a fundamental architecture that is, when you squint at it, not entirely different from the medieval village. Private space combined with shared space. Individual autonomy combined with collective life. The freedom to close your door combined with the community that exists when you open it. And here is the question I find most interesting about this. The people building these communities in Denmark in 1972 did not set out to recreate the medieval village. They had never heard of the commons. They were not trying to reverse the enclosure movement or recover the pottage pot or restore the fire to the centre of the room. They were just trying to solve a problem they could feel in their daily lives. The problem of being a human animal, social communal, wired for connection, living in a physical environment designed around the assumption that you wanted to be alone. They found the answer essentially by accident in something very old. There is a moment I keep coming back to from an article about the architect Grace Kim, who founded a co-housing community in Seattle in 2016. She gave a talk about why she did it, and she said this: "The danger of achieving the American dream is a false sense of connection and an increase in social isolation." She had designed her own home in a co-housing development with the shared spaces deliberately positioned to make encounter inevitable. The parking lot at one end, the common house in the middle, the private homes at the other end. If you want to get from your car to your front door, you have to walk past your neighbours. You will see them. They will see you. Something will happen. It is such a small thing, and such an ancient thing. The central fire placed in the middle of the room, the common land arranged so everyone passes through it, the village oven positioned where you have to wait with other people. All of this technology of togetherness invented and reinvented, lost and recovered across thousands of years of human habitation has been pointing at the same simple truth that human beings do not flourish in isolation. Not because isolation is morally wrong or spiritually bankrupt or historically unprecedented, but because we are built for each other, because our brains developed in conditions of constant social contact, and they still expect that contact, even when our houses tell us we don't need it. The medieval family in their single room was not the model. Neither was the Victorian house full of private bedrooms and closed doors. Neither, it turned out, was the perfect suburban house, with its manicured lawn and its television, and its feeling of glorious, terrifying isolation. What we seem to be groping towards slowly, awkwardly in co-housing developments and shared gardens and neighbourhood associations and slow checkout lanes and happy-to-chat benches in parks is something in between. Privacy when you need it. Presence when you want it. A door you can close and a community you come back to when you open it. It is not the medieval world. But it is not entirely unlike the medieval instinct. And so as we reach the end of this long journey through every room our ancestors ever shared, every fire they ever gathered around, every meal they ate together, and every wall they eventually built between themselves and each other, there is one final thing I want to say to you. One observation about what all of this means, not as history, as something that might matter to how you actually live, because everything we have talked about tonight, the shared rooms, the communal beds, the central fire, the village commons, the private bedroom, the suburban house, the co-housing revival, is not just a story about the past. It is a map of a question that every person alive right now is navigating every single day, and the answer is closer than you might think. There is a moment somewhere in this long story we have been telling tonight that I keep returning to. Not a dramatic moment, not a battle or a discovery or a turning point in history, just a quiet image. A woman standing in a field after harvest. The summer is ending. The light is going sideways across the stubble, and she and her children are walking slowly through what was this morning a wheat field, bending down every few steps to pick up the single heads of grain that fell from the harvester's hands. Gleaning. Working the ground after the great work is done, collecting what remains. She does not own this field. She has no legal deed to any part of it. But she is there, and the custom says she may be there, and the grain she collects will help feed her family through November. It is not much, but it is something. And the thing I keep thinking about standing beside her in my imagination is this: she is not alone. There are other women and children spread across the field. They can see each other. They are doing the same work. And sometimes one of them straightens up and says something to another, and there is laughter, or the exchange of a complaint about the weather, or someone's child runs toward someone else's child, and they collapse into the stubble together. This is not a story about poverty. It is a story about texture. The texture of a life in which you are regularly, unavoidably in the company of other people, going about the same work of surviving. That texture is what we have been tracing all night, through the Roman tenements and the medieval longhouses, through the perpetual pot on the fire and the fasting calendar and the village oven, through the children learning by proximity, the women brewing ale in the back of the workshop, the commons that everyone walked across every day on the way to everywhere else, through the beds that held whole families and the great bed of war that once legend has it, held 52 people on a single night, through Benjamin Franklin debating a window while the fate of a nation waited in the dark outside, all of it pointing toward the same ancient fact that human beings are not built to be alone, not because solitude is wrong, but because our species spent its first 200,000 years, maybe more, in conditions of constant social contact. Our brains were shaped by that contact. Our immune systems respond to it. Our stress hormones quiet down when we are near people we trust. The neuropeptide oxytocin, which floods through us during moments of connection, holding a child, sharing a meal, sitting close to someone in the dark, is not a luxury chemical. It is a biological expectation. Our bodies expect community. They go looking for it. When they cannot find it, they register the absence as a threat. And here we are, the most technologically connected generation in the history of the species, the most comfortable by almost any material measure that humans have ever been, living in houses with central heating and indoor plumbing and food that does not require 4 months of labour to produce, and experiencing, according to the United States Surgeon General's 2023 advisory, a crisis of social connection so serious that being chronically lonely is estimated to have the same health impact as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. 15 cigarettes a day. The math is not the point. The fact that we needed that comparison, that we had to reach for an analogy involving cigarettes to convey the severity, is the point. We have built collectively and individually a world of such extraordinary private comfort that we have almost engineered out of our lives the thing our bodies most require. Now, I want to be honest here because I have been honest all night, and you deserve the same honesty at the end as at the beginning. I am not telling you that medieval life was better. I'm not saying we should sleep in piles of straw with pigs in the corner. I am not making a romantic argument for poverty or against indoor plumbing, or for any version of the past that required most women to live without autonomy, or most people to die before the age of 50. What I am saying is something more specific and I think more interesting. The medieval peasant did not choose her community. She was born into it. The shared room and the common field and the village oven were not lifestyle choices, they were the architecture of necessity. And what we now know from looking at that architecture from the outside is that it produced something valuable as a side effect of its compulsion, a life in which you were regularly, structurally, unavoidably in contact with other people. A life with social density built into its walls. We removed the compulsion. That was good. That was necessary. People deserve autonomy. They deserve privacy. They deserve the right to close a door and be alone with their own thoughts. But somewhere in the process of removing the compulsion, we also removed the structure. We dismantled the architecture of encounter, the common land, the village green, the shared oven, the corridor-less house where every room connects to every other room, and replaced it with an architecture of separation. Fences, garages, cars that move us from sealed private space to sealed private space without requiring us to stand next to anyone at all. And then we wondered why we were lonely. The co-housing movements and the intentional communities and the slow checkout lanes and the happy-to-chat benches that we talked about at the end of part 11, all of these are the same impulse wearing modern clothes, the same recognition that has surfaced over and over again across all of this history, that something essential goes missing when people stop encountering each other. But here is what I find most encouraging about this moment right now in the world we live in. We are beginning to remember, not everyone, not all at once, not in any coordinated, systematic way, but there are architects designing buildings that force you to walk past your neighbours. There are neighbourhoods buying up adjacent lots and turning them back into something resembling commons. There are families sometimes related, sometimes not, choosing to live closer together, to share dinners more regularly, to build the informal webs of mutual support that the suburb was never designed to accommodate. And there are people like you lying in the dark right now listening to a story about how families used to share space and food and daily life, thinking about what that meant, maybe thinking about the people in the next room or down the street or on the other end of a phone that you have not called in longer than you planned. The medieval family sitting around their central fire did not have what we have. They did not have the privacy, the autonomy, the comfort, the medical care, the freedom from back-breaking physical labour. Their children died at rates that would destroy us to contemplate. Their lives were often genuinely hard in ways we cannot fully imagine, but they had something we are slowly, imperfectly, beautifully trying to find our way back to. The knowledge not as an idea, but as a daily lived experience that the people around them were not optional, were not background, were not extras in the story of their own individual lives, were the story. The fire in the centre of the room was not just warmth. It was the organising principle of a world that understood without needing to articulate it, that a human life lived without others is not a full human life. And here you are right now in the dark, not alone, because whoever is reading this to you, or whoever made this, spent hours in a room putting it together for you. Because the historians whose research I have drawn on tonight spent careers trying to make sure that the woman in the field, the child with clay, on her fingers, the man sharing a bed with the stranger in a New Jersey inn, that they are not forgotten. 'Cause you chose to spend this time here, which means you understand, even if only half-consciously, that a story told together is worth something. The fire never really went out. It just moved. And tonight, in whatever room you are in, wherever you are in the world, it is still here. That was part 12 and the end of our journey tonight. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself thinking differently about the rooms you live in, the meals you share, the neighbours you pass without stopping, I would love to know. Leave a comment. Tell me which part hit you hardest. Tell me whether you think we lost something real or gained something worth the trade, or both. And if you found a friend who you think should hear this story, send it to them. Not because the algorithm needs it, but because sharing a story with someone you care about is, in a very small and real way, exactly what we have been talking about for the last 2.5 hours. Take good care of each other. Good night.